This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, Cody, we definitely have a packed show for today. I know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about some big pay-per-view events. A classic show and a modern show. One that gave me a little bit of revisionist history when people talked about it being one of the worst pay-per-view events of all time. It is interesting when you go back and watch old wrestling shows and compare how they stack up with what you see with the modern product. Really gives you some perspective. But since this is going to be a long show, because of what we have on the docket for today, we're going to speed right through these intros here. So welcome new and returning viewers to the FSWR podcast. We are on YouTube and Rumble every Monday and Friday for new content. If you are watching for the first time, make sure to subscribe, like the show, leave a comment, and click the bell icon so you can stay notified of when our posts go up every week. I am cautiously optimistic that I'll be able to get this up on Monday, but since we are dealing with a relatively stacked number of content here, I'm wondering if I might actually end up getting this posted on Tuesday, depending on how editing goes. Because I do edit my own podcasts. I have nobody working for me. I do this for free, and I do it my damn self. But for our Monday podcast today, we have two pay-per-view events that we're going to be reviewing. We have, as part of our Retro Review Series extension, WWF SummerSlam 1993, which actually took place on a Monday night. It was August 30th, 1993, a rare weekday WWF hosted event that actually kind of threw things off for the following Monday Night Raws because with SummerSlam 93 airing on a Monday and the following week being a Labor Day weekend, they actually went 3 weeks before airing their next episode of Raw, which I know, it would feel like sacrilege when you compare it to today. You know, Monday night is almost a religious experience for most wrestling fans, whether or not they actually like the current product, but they know that Monday nights are Raw nights, so that must have thrown a lot of people off back in the day when that happened. But in addition to talking about SummerSlam, we will also be reviewing NWA 74 two-night event from the Chase Ballroom in St. Louis, Missouri. Perhaps the last NWA hosted event that we will be talking about on this channel for the foreseeable future. But I will fill you in with the details after we talk about both nights. Seeing as how this one's already going to be running long to begin with, let's just dive right into this thing. We will begin with the SummerSlam 93 discussion. A very interesting show to go back and watch for historical purposes. We said we were going to review it, and by cracky, are we going to deliver on that promise? It was not quite the struggle to sit through as I imagined it would be. It's funny because SummerSlam 93 has one of those reputations for being an all-time bad SummerSlam, and having gone back and watched it again, I don't really know if it's a conclusion people came to because of how bad the main event was, or if people just genuinely thought the show was horrible. For me, it was somewhere ranging on the spectrum from pretty good to pretty abysmal at times. I will note, the show totally fell off a cliff by the time we got to the whole Bret Hart, Jerry Lawler debacle, which we'll cover in detail once we get there. But would I classify this as an all-time terrible SummerSlam? Maybe not. You know, I'd also have to go back and watch the entire SummerSlam library, and off the top of my head, I can't really think of which one I would determine as the worst of the bunch. I mean, 95 was generally a wretched year for the WWF period, so my instincts would tell me SummerSlam 95 would probably rank among the all-time worst, but, you know, then again, there's still the SummerSlam shows from the latter 2000s that I seem to recall being pretty goddamn atrocious, so it's hard to say. But as I went back and rewatched this thing in full, it was not as terrible as I remember it being. It did take place from the Palace of Auburn Hills in Michigan. And of course, this is where we get into the whole debate over attendance and gate numbers and how much the numbers were skewed here. Wikipedia says attendance was 23,954. That seems a bit high to me, personally. If there were 20,000 people in attendance, I would probably take that as a more believable number. But I'm not going to get hung up on it. That's more of Dave Meltzer's shtick. As per usual with these events, though, we're going to run down the card for everything and talk about the matches and how everything went down. We've been covering a lot of the story elements with the Raw coverage, so I won't spend copious amounts of time revisiting all the story build to the matches. You know, if you want context, just go watch my Retro Raw reviews we've been doing in the build-up to the show over the last month. But we begin the pay-per-view with the Ted DiBiase Razor Ramon match. Even though the feud has mostly been built around Money Incorporated going after both Razor and the 1-2-3 Kid, and instead of just booking a regular tag match with all four guys, they decided to split them up into two separate singles matches. Still never got that. Generally, I would say this was the strongest match on the card to go with as an opener. I guess in hindsight, they also could have swapped this with the 1-2-3 Kid IRS match as a curtain jerker, but either way, it made sense. You got two upper mid-card guys with no titles at stake. It's a program they've been drawing attention to on the TV show, but it's not anything you'd consider like a main event feud or anything. You know, plus when you factor in the babyface went over here, it was probably better to open with this one for a hot start to get the crowd invested from the beginning. Always great hearing Bobby Heenan try and validate heels cheating. An example in this match being the spot where DiBiase has Razor in the sleeper, and Vince is trying to call it an illegal choke. So Heenan says that it is perfectly fine because Razor has an unusually large Adam's apple, so there is no avoiding the usage of a choke. We'll definitely have plenty more to say about Bobby Eaton throughout this show. And the finish was pretty great too, as DiBiase goes to unhook the corner buckle pad behind the ref's back, and when Razor gets back in, DiBiase tries to drive his head into the corner, but Razor reverses it, and then he gives DiBiase a pretty impressive-looking Razor's Edge for the 3, made even better by Bobby Heenan screaming into the headset, "No, Teddy, no!" as he gets driven down into the mat. The thing I mostly liked about the match is that even though it was really short, I mean, it only went like about 7 minutes in total, but they packed a lot of action into this, and they kept things moving. Actually kind of felt like an old-school Mid-South match, which, I mean, with DiBiase wrestling here, I'm not all that surprised, but that's kind of the vibe I got with this. You know, there was no dead air time, everything flowed, they worked hard, and the babyface went over after foiling the heel's attempts at cheating. Good start to the show. And from this point, things kind of took an interesting turn for both guys. For DiBiase, this was his last official WWF match, and I think if I'm not mistaken, his last match period. Because it's not too long from now where he ends up having to retire due to neck complications, and before you know it, he's showing up on Nitro as part of the NWO in mid-96 as a manager. For Hall, he ends up getting transitioned into the Intercontinental title scene with Shawn, and they'll eventually start planting the seeds for their big Mania showdown. So it's kind of a tale of two cities for both guys. One's fallout from the show ends in an unexpected misfortune, and the other, it's sort of a launching point for his career. And then we had the first of many cringe moments on this pay-per-view event. And who should kickstart that series of discomfort than with Todd Pettingill, as he tries to conduct a ringside interview with, not making this up, Mama Steiner, as he'd refer to her. And it appeared Sista Steiner was there too. But, well, first he awkwardly asks where Papa Steiner is, to which Mama Steiner says, homesick. And his follow-up question is to ask her what she used to tell Rick and Scott when they were young boys when they wrestled in the house, including, no Frankensteiners by my good lamps. And Mama Steiner's response, she just goes, whatever you say. No fucking clue what this idiot was talking about. Probably the first time she ever heard the name Frankensteiner in her entire life. Although now that I look back at it, could you have imagined how great it would have been if Sister Steiner would have hooked up with Scott in the latter stages of WCW when he just went totally batshit insane? She could have been a Nitro girl. And by the way, we've seen a lot of these Todd Pettingill infomercials on Raw, and I've kind of glossed over the majority of them because of how bizarre they are. When you look up the term Caucasian in the dictionary, I can assure you that somewhere out there, there's a version that reads a definition of Todd Pettingill. Because by God, that guy was whiter than a goddamn Wilco concert. No offense to Wilco. So that was a total abomination of a segment. Luckily, it was instantly made up for by Jim Cornette getting on the microphone and introducing the Heavenly Bodies for the next match. In a neck brace, by the way. And of course, they were wrestling the Steiner brothers here for the WWF Tag Team titles. The neck brace thing with Cornette, we were told from Vince that it was due to complications in the Smoky Mountain regions. If I'm not mistaken, I think this was right around the point where they shot the blow-off with him and Bullet Bob. So Corny had basically had to pitch to the WWF that in order to keep kayfabe, he had to come in with a neck brace to sell the effects of getting beaten up from Armstrong in Knoxville. Again, back when the boys actually paid attention to detail. And we've talked about the build to this on the Raw shows, but the one thing that hit me here once I saw both guys in the ring standing across from each other, they really did a shitty job building to any kind of heat or issue with these two teams. Because I'm trying to think back to Raw. What did we see? We saw Cornette show up on Raw to cut that great debut promo with Bobby Heenan in the ring. He challenged the Steiners to a title match. The Heavenly Bodies had one TV squash. And I don't think we had seen either team interact with each other on the show one time before this. I guess as an interpromotional one-and-done kind of favor, it didn't need to be this elaborate blood feud or anything, but I don't know. For a team like the Steiners going up against the Heavenly Bodies, it's certainly a feud that you'd think they'd have wanted to draw more attention to than they did, but whatever. This was not quite peak Scott Steiner in terms of going into genetic mutation. He wasn't quite Freakzilla or Big Papa Pump quite yet, but he only got bigger from this point onward, especially in his WCW days. And this was kind of the prototypical Steiner Brothers match that we've all come to know and love. It's several opening minutes of Rick and Scott are going to pick Tom Pritchard and Jimmy Del Rey up. They're going to throw them around the ring for a while and wherever the chips fall sort of thing. Hopefully not dropping them on their heads and necks in the process. And that was kind of the layout of the whole match. The Steiners took about 70% of the action. There was a good cutoff spot where the heels took out Steiner's leg during a double team to work him over for a while. More greatness from Heenan here during the heat portion of the match, where Corny gave Scotty a racket shot to the throat from the floor, and Heenan says, "Cornette hitting someone with a racket? No, that couldn't happen." And eventually Rick got the big hot tag at the end, ran wild on everyone. They built up to the big false finish where Corny tossed in the racket for Dr. Tom to use, but they only got a 2 count out of it. And the big finish sees Jimmy Del Rey go up for a moonsault press, but he ends up taking out Dr. Tom by accident. So Scott whips him off the ropes, plants him with a Frankensteiner, and gets the pin. And, of course, you got Cornette in a fit of hysterics after the fact. You know, when you actually look at the layout of everything, it was all very formulaic. You know, a paint-by-numbers tag team match. Just, you throw in big names like the Steiners, and even to a lesser degree, Dr. Tom and Jimmy Del Rey, who also held up on their end. It can make everything seem so much bigger league because you got people emotionally invested, and you got the crowd holding on to almost every spot in that match. You know, this is the kind of thing that's missing in today's tag team wrestling. Actual top-level established teams that people give a shit about and have any form of emotional investment in. You know, before you say the beta bucks, I reiterate again, top-level teams, not indie marks whose only audience is a subset of internet mouth breathers like cartwheels and backflips for no reason. I mean, real teams that can actually draw money, i.e. FTR, if they ever get out of AEW purgatory. Anyway, fun tag match, and up to this point, the show was actually rolling along relatively smoothly. Perhaps this show wasn't as bad as I remember it being. Don't worry, it eventually fell off the rails. Then we had the Shawn Michaels Mr. Perfect Intercontinental Championship match. Well, first, we had Joe Fowler interviewing Shawn and Diesel in the back. And who is Joe Fowler, you ask? I have no idea. Other than, apparently he was a sports broadcaster who made Todd Pettingale look moderately tolerable by comparison. This man, he overacted just about everything he was involved with on this show. And this fucking Fowler guy was everywhere on this goddamn show. Interview after interview after interview after interview, and with each passing moment I saw him on camera, the more I wanted to reach through my monitor and gouge his eyes out. The thing about that, the guy was interviewing Kevin Nash and Shawn Michaels, and who is the one guy here that I wanted to single-handedly punch in the face? Joe Fowler. That takes some skill. Anyway, we talked a minute ago about the rather lackluster build to the tag title match, but at least I can credit them for at least putting both teams on TV in the last few weeks. Have we seen Shawn Michaels or Mr. Perfect on Raw in any of the last couple shows we reviewed? I know Shawn had a title match with Marty Jannetty, and that was 3 weeks ago by now? And for Hennig, most of his segments have been 30-second squash matches with no angles or promos. So if the build to the Steiners Bodies match was mid, I'd say the build to this was an epic fail. As a match, it was fine. Certainly not a bad match, but I don't know, is it accurate to say it was historically boring? Particularly for a Shawn Michaels match. You know, the one thing I'll never take away from Shawn was the fact that his work was generally good to great most of the time. You know, the personality is a whole different discussion, but as a worker, the guy was extraordinarily gifted. Here, it kind of looked like two guys going through the motions and doing spots. There was a part early on in the match where Shawn did a reversal off the ropes to Hennig, and when he came back, both guys just sort of fell down on the mat. I have no clue what the hell that was supposed to be. But, yeah, they wrestled. They did a lot of holds. There's a spot where Diesel ran a distraction to Hennig on the floor, and Shawn caught him with a super kick. And that's the point that I realized, oh, yeah, Technically, Shawn wasn't using the super kick as a finish at this point. It was just part of his offensive moveset. Shawn spent some time working over Henig's back until he started making his comeback. And after what was essentially a 10-minute snooze fest, the finish is Diesel ramming Hennig into the outside steps while Shawn took the ref, and Shawn retained by countout. And just to make Hennig look even more like a geek, he tried to get a little bit of revenge after the bell. Also, Diesel could lay him out with a black glove again, and the heels walked to the back. Yeah. Like, I'm not going to go too knee-deep into the whole Shawn tangent again. If you want my personal take on the guy, just go back and listen to some of the Raw reviews I've done, especially the one where I talked about my personal take on Shawn. I guess that would have been the match he had with Marty Jannetty. You know, like I said, I respected what the guy was capable of doing in the ring, but the problem here is that he really didn't give me much to work on with that. You know, I think a lot of people at the time expected more out of this than what they got, and I mean, it ended up being a major letdown by the end, because Hennig was a hell of a worker too in his heyday, but you know, by the time we get here to 93, the guy was really broken down. He had that series of back injuries a few years prior that he needed surgery for, and it basically forced him into retirement for a period of time. And, you know, and I think the reality of the situation in hindsight is people put a lot more stock in Hennig's ability to go than what his body was really capable of holding up, especially by 1993, because he was another guy that wasn't involved in the ring much longer after the show. He didn't jump ship to WCW until a few years later, but you know, he really wasn't an active wrestler in the WWF at any point after the end of 93. He did some commentating sporadically, but he wasn't really getting involved in the ring much longer after this because of all the back issues. I remember they went through a series where they tried to get him back in the ring doing programs, and one thing led to another. The guy could just never stay healthy enough. It's a shame. Following that was Erwin R. Shyster versus the 1-2-3 Kid. Rotunda also had a pre-match promo where he said the following statement: Detroit used to be known as the Motor City. Now it is known as the Tax Cheat City. That was literally his only line. What a promo. And I'll tell you one thing I remembered here after having not seen a Mike Rotunda match in quite a while. That guy was a fucking great worker. The IRS gimmick was dumb as shit, but man, when it came bell time, that dude worked his butt off. And, you know, when you think about where Sean Waltman was in terms of career development, you know, he really hadn't been around the business that long at this point. He was still very young, very green. And with this being his first official pay-per-view debut in a major organization, you know, Rotunda was a great guy to pair him with as a dance partner, because, you know, Rotunda was going to be able to go in there and guide him, call spots where they were needed. And they worked this to the strength of what made the 1-2-3 Kid matches flow back in the day. You know, the guy would sell and work from underneath for the majority of the match. He'd get his series of hope spots and flash pins where the people would pop, because the story they had culminated was he could win from out of nowhere at any time because he was so quick on his feet. So, you know, Rotunda carried the bulk of the action. He fed for Waltman when it was time for him to get in his hope spots. And kind of like the opener, they managed to pack a lot in here for what ended up being a pretty short match. And the finish, which was, well... What else is there to say other than classic Bobby Heenan? The finish is IRS giving Waltman a running shoulder tackle off the ropes for the 3 count, which then leads to Heenan breaking out the brain scan gimmick, where he tries to do a sports breakdown to the finish, and the payoff is him doing a frame-by-frame analysis of the finishing sequence. Also, he could scribble in 1040 on the screen, and then he let out a big belly laugh. And of course, Vince with the patented, "Oh, Bobby Heenan" line. Get it? 1040? Tax jokes. The kids will never get it. I certainly didn't get it at the time. And this was about the point where the show officially went off the rails as far as I was concerned. Because up next, we had the Bret Hart versus Jerry the King Lawler match. And this thing... I know I'm probably going to get a lot of heat for this, especially from any of the old timers. Let's just kind of break the segment down and talk about what they did, and then I'll go off on why I hated it so much. And before we even get to the particulars of anything, you have to keep in mind that the entire Bret Lawler feud in the summer of '93, it was all staged around the story of who the actual King of the Ring was. So Bret won the King of the Ring tournament. Lawler showed up and started berating the Hart family by saying he was the true king. And that was pretty much the extent of the feud. And you also have to understand that at the same time this was going on, Bret Hart was recently coming off a run as the WWF champion, where he had lost the belt to Yoko at WrestleMania, presumably was supposed to work a program with Hogan, but that whole drama. And instead of Bret entering the title picture again in the summer, here he found himself in a mid-card program with Lawler, where they were fighting over artificial titles. And I was never a big Bret guy to begin with, but I mean, come on. The guy was your top champion less than 4 months ago, and this is what you have him doing in the summer of that same year? And then they booked this calamity, for lack of better terms. And man, I even remember watching this live as a kid and thinking to myself when it was over, that was really dumb. It starts with Lawler coming out on crutches, and he starts diving into a heat promo on his recent happenings in the state of Michigan. He goes into a whole tirade on personally renting out a Michigan-made vehicle once he landed from the airport so that he could drive to the arena. But because it is a Michigan-made car, it came with all kinds of glitches and problems where the brakes did not work. There were all these technical malfunctions. And before you knew it, Lawler found himself in a 10-car pileup on the interstate. And the greatest thing is that, Lawler's cutting this heat promo and talking about a blue-haired elderly woman that pulled out in front of him on the interstate, and Bobby Heenan casually interjects with, must have been Helen Hart. I popped. So, yeah, he's doing his shtick, and I mean, it's actually a genuinely funny promo if you just sit back and think about all the classic heel Lawler promos you've ever heard over the years. I didn't have a problem with that at all. But then they had to get way too creative and cute with everything. So Lawler's standing there going, there's nothing more that I would like to do than go in there and take you to school, Bret. But the doctors refused to clear me to wrestle tonight, so therefore, I am bringing out a suitable replacement opponent, Doink the Clown. And I immediately went, oh God. So not only is Bret now doing a mid-card comedy angle with Jerry Lawler on one of their Big Four shows, but now he has to wrestle an impromptu match with the fucking Clown. And that is not me taking shots at the guy under the gimmick. I am nothing against Matt Bourne. Guy was a hell of a worker. But the gimmick, man, it was so lame to me, even as a kid. So they do the match, and I'll admit, had it just been Bret Hart wrestling a non-gimmicked Matt Bourne, it would have been more visually appealing, but watching Bret in there wrestling with the clown gimmick, it just looked visually unappealing to me. It's like really the best way I can describe it. It's one of their top stars wrestling a comedy act. It's actually kind of on par in today's business of watching any of AEW's upper mid-card guys or seriously taken wrestlers wrestling a comedy goof like Orange Cassidy or fucking Danhausen. I mean, for modern day comparisons, could Can you imagine Dax Harwood wrestling one of those guys, or Cash Wheeler? Doesn't work there, and to me, it didn't work here in 93 with Brett and Doink either. Again, it's no disrespect to Matt Bourne. He was a very talented guy, but the clown gimmick, I didn't buy it on paper. The match was good, but between the visual and the fact that you had Lawler on the outside causing distractions the whole time, at one point you have Owen and Bruce Hart getting involved ringside. The whole thing just became too much of a clusterfuck to keep track of anything. Between that and Heenan making divorce jokes with Stu and Helen at certain points, the whole thing just felt off from the start. So, fast forwarding along, we get to the finish, and I think this little angle at the end was very telling for what they were about to do next, because I watched this happen, and as soon as I saw that initial blow that Lawler gave to Brett with a crutch, I thought, that seems stiff as fuck. And sure enough, it led to some personal heat with the guys for the next part of the segment. So, Brett's got Doink in the sharpshooter, and Lawler ends up running in and hitting Brett over the side of the head with a crutch. And when I say he hit Brett with this crutch, he wasn't holding back. He hit this fucker right in the side of the face and neck. And when I look back at it, I think it was a botch. Because not only is Brett covering up after the fact and pretty much no-selling all of Lawler's subsequent crutch shots, but he's got a firm grip on his neck, almost like he got shaken up by it. I think Lawler was supposed to hit him over the back with it, but he either mistimed it or who knows, maybe that heat was more personal than what we were led to believe. Had they just ended things there, I probably would have been fine with it. Because at the end of the day, it's like, all right, you got your heat, Brett won by DQ, and now you have the ability to build an actual blow-off between the two down the road with Brett presumably going over clean. Oh, how little did I know at the time. Because while all this chaos is ensuing, you got the officials running out to try and separate both guys. The Harts are still at ringside trying to get their hands on Lawler. And things eventually boil over to where Jack Tunney, the president at the time, comes out from the back and tells Lawler that he is not getting away with his bullshit. The people paid to see him wrestle, so he now has to wrestle Brett right now, otherwise he will be banned from the WWF. Which then begs a good question for all the historians out there. Why did Jack Tunney wait until now to order Jerry Lawler back to the ring to wrestle Brett? Not only has Brett just been through a grueling 10-minute match with Doink, where Lawler would be fresh as a daisy to just go in there and pick the bones, but it was totally apparent that Lawler was bullshitting the injury as soon as he walked through the curtain. Once he brought up the whole thing about doctors not clearing him, how hard would it have been for Jack Tunney or anyone in management to just go to the medical room and ask for the doctor's note? Would have taken all of 5 minutes, and Tunney could have saved everyone the trouble by just coming out and telling Lawler, no, your story's bullshit, you're going in the ring and wrestling Brett right now. So that whole thing never made sense to begin with. And then we come to the bigger problem, when we get to the actual Brett Lawler part of the match. Because then they actually do the match, and this thing goes almost another 7 full minutes before we get the total garbage finish. You got Brett dominating Lawler for the first part until Lawler cuts him off with a crutch behind the ref's back. God, he's getting more heat on Brett with driving him crotch first into the ring post. Brett eventually milks a comeback at the end, which at this point I realized just how fucking incredible Brett's cardio was back in the day. Good Lord. But this finish, oh my God, this infamously bad finish. So Brett locks in the sharpshooter on Lawler, and he's in the hold for about a minute until the ref calls for the bell and declares Brett the winner via submission. But Brett refuses to release the hold after the bell, and this spawns just about everyone but the United States Army to come out and try to forcibly pry Brett off of Lawler while he's got him locked in this hold. You know, at one point you got the officials yanking Brett by the hair, he still won't let go. And this goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. Brett is sinking back in this hold, refusing to let go. Lawler is... I don't know what Lawler's doing. I honestly think he fell asleep at one point because he wasn't moving at one point. I just figured he just decided to close his eyes and take a nap for a little bit. And it all eventually boils over to where I think it was Owen that managed to get Brett to let go. And then came the announcement. Your winner via decision reversal due to Brett refusing to break the hold, the undisputed king of the ring, Jerry the King Lawler. And I even remember watching this as a kid, and I mean, I understood that they were trying to channel old school Memphis TV, and to a degree, I look back with modern eyes, and it worked, but this whole thing just went on and on and on and on for a fucking eternity. And when you even analyze it from here, and you realize that this feud kind of carried over the next couple of years on and off without really actually having a proper conclusion of Brett going over Lawler clean in a one-on-one capacity, I don't know, it kind of makes the whole thing even more of a turnoff in hindsight. To me, I think this would have been better served with them not dragging Doink into it, and they could have shaved the whole thing down to about 15 minutes instead of going almost a full half hour when you include the Lawler promo and all the ringside angles. It was too much. And again, this is viewing this from someone who wasn't the biggest Bret Hart fan growing up, but when I think back to what this feud actually could have been, and if they would have made it a more serious main event program, I probably would have been on board with it. But by this point, Bret was already an established top guy. And when you remove him from the title picture and you immediately shoehorn him into this mid-card story with Lawler that really didn't do a whole lot for Bret in terms of career development, I don't know, like the whole thing just felt like a placeholder to give him something to do while Vince was trying to get over this Luger experiment. It was just a waste to me. It felt like a total waste of both guys. I never liked this feud, and when I went back and watched it again, I see why a lot of people shook their heads at it. Ideally, a program with Lawler and Bret should have worked, but when you factor in the booking and some of the behind-the-scenes issues that both guys had with each other, made things difficult to get things to work with these two. As an old-school angle, I didn't have a problem with the concept of what they did. I just don't think the execution came off well. Then we had a pretty iconic Ludwig Borga pre-tape before his match with Marty Jannetty. Speaking of failed execution, I actually totally forgot that this was part of Borga's character in the WWF. Along with running with the stereotypical evil foreigner gimmick, he would also do pre-tape segments disparaging the American people for being corruptive environmentalists. And here he was shooting a tape in front of a crumbling building in, somewhere in the vicinity of Auburn Hills, Michigan, saying, "This is what men like Lex Luger are proud to represent. A country filled with crumbling buildings, waste and filth, and pollution." To which I said, "No, actually, that's mostly just a representation of shithole suburban cities." You could say the same for places like New York City, most big cities in California, or pretty much any suburban city run by Democrats. So then we had the Jannetty Borga match, another throwaway TV match that they booked on one of their big four shows, and it showed. No offense to Ludwig Borga, but, again, We always revert back to talking about this point being the cartoon era of the WWF, where everyone was saddled with a goofy gimmick of some sort. And the thing with Borga is that he was another one of Vince's pet projects when this character debuted. This was all Vince. He loved the concept of this evil foreigner gimmick, and even though they had the character built from Finland, they were still going to try and go all in with him in the main event picture. I think, they immediately threw him in the program with Luger soon after this show. And by the way, I appreciated the sign in the crowd that read, Lardvig's H section. Anyway, they had a match. It was painfully dull. They did some stuff. Jannetty got in a couple hope spots, but Borga pretty much dominated the whole match. And the finish saw Borga catch Jannetty off a crossbody attempt. He hit him with a front power slam, and then he quickly pulled him up to his feet so he could put him in a modified torture rack for the ref stoppage. Like I said, they were going all in on this character. Obviously, the big talking point from Vince and Heenan in this match surrounded Tatanka, who, as we may remember, ended up losing to Borga in his first documented WWF defeat. So that is also something to look forward to in the coming weeks, because that was also about the point where they totally killed Tatanka's character. All it took was one job to Ludwig Borga, and dead. Dead as a doormat. Speaking of dead, we then had the Rest in Peace match with introductions from The Fink, as his graphics read. And per rules of the RIP match, here's what we determined after weeks of wondering, what the hell is a Rest in Peace match? It is no DQ, no countouts, and there must be a decisive winner. That was the entire layout of the match rules. No DQ, no countouts, and there must be a winner. So in other words, it is a no DQ match. Good to know. It's Giant Gonzalez versus The Undertaker, the infamous rematch from their classic from WrestleMania 9 that nobody wanted to see. And by classic, I mean a match that was so ungodly wretched, it still ranks among the worst WrestleMania matches of all time. And think about all the bad Mania matches we've seen over the years. Keep in mind, the entire build to this match was centered around several weeks of TV where the main focus was on Undertaker's feud with Mr. Hughes, which to this day I still don't think they ever paid off. I don't believe we've seen a single appearance from Gonzalez on any of the actual Raw programs. And it's been a long time since I've gone back and rewatched this. Quite frankly, I didn't remember a whole lot about it to begin with. Probably because I tried to absolve all memories of their Mania match, which was disreputably bad. But I'll be damned. This was not as bad as I remember it being. Yeah, it was still no good. It was mostly all smoke and mirrors, thanks in large part to The Undertaker being a phenomenal worker. Basically having to go in there and wrestle a guy with two left feet. But that's pretty much the best way I can summarize this. They did everything in their power to get the most out of what was essentially very little. They played up the story that The Undertaker was essentially powerless because he did not have Paul Bearer by his side with the urn. The urn was still in possession of Harvey Whippleman, so Taker spent a large chunk of the match selling and taking a beating. God, looking back in hindsight, I can't believe I'm actually talking about this. There would be moments where Taker would get thrown into the steps on the floor or he'd get laid out in the ring and he'd try to do the sit-up, but he couldn't muster up the strength to do it. And of course, you fast forward about midway through, and that is when the gong goes off. And who should come out but the returning Paul Bearer? carrying out the black wreath that he had been bringing out on Raw. By far, the highlight of the match is the moment where Paul lays out Harvey Whippleman with a punch to reclaim the urn over in the corner, doing the classic, "Oh yes!" I can never really do a Paul Bearer impersonation, but Steven Crowder does a really good one, actually. That obviously got a big pop. So while Gonzalez had his back turned to Taker, he could do the zombie sit-up. The number one went crazy for that. And from there, Taker ends up giving Gonzalez a series of staggering clotheslines off the ropes. He goes up top, hits a big tackle clothesline, and he gets the 3 count. And somehow, some way, they pulled this fucking thing off and got the people to care by the end. And you all wonder why Taker's my favorite wrestler of all time. This match, managing to somehow pry a watchable match out of Giant Gonzalez of all people. Ain't too many guys in the business that could have feasibly come close to making that happen, but Taker was one of a kind. What can you say? So, yeah, that was the first ever Rest in Peace match, and at the same time, the last ever Rest in Peace match. I wonder why. The next match I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about. It was a completely random 6-man with the Smoking Guns teaming with Tatanka to wrestle Bam Bam Bigelow and the Head Shrinkers. It was a TV match, a quite boring TV match at that. I almost fell asleep at least twice. They did a lot of moves, most of which was carried by the heels because they were far and away the better workers than the faces. And the finish saw all 3 heels go for stereo top rope headbutts, but Tatanka moved out of the way. And after the Guns took out Bam Bam and one of the Head Shrinkers on the floor, Tatanka rolled up the other one in the ring for a schoolboy and won the match. That's pretty much all there is to say about it. I had no memory of this going in, and after they rang the bell for the finish, it had totally escaped my mind yet again. By far, though, when we talk about the most cringe-worthy things on this entire show, nothing can hold a candle to what transpired before this main event. We had Todd Pettingale ringside with one of the Michigan fans who was sporting quite the attire. And of course, Todd's trying to get some insight on the inspiration behind this outfit. And no joke, the guy's answer was exactly what I pictured in my mind him giving. He said his mom went to Sears and bought a bedsheet and a pillowcase, and he asked her to make an outfit out of it, and he actually wore it in public on camera for this pay-per-view event. Yep. The epitome of basement dwellers right here on live national pay-per-view. Stay in school, kids. That's all I'm going to say about that. But finally, we've come to the main event. And boy, what a memorable main event it was. It's been a good while since I've gone back and rewatched this match in full. And after having gone back and relived it again, I'm glad I avoided it for the better part of 10 years. It is Yokozuna defending the World Wrestling Federation Championship against challenger Lex Luger. And I think what we should do here is establish a little bit of a backstory, just in case there are any people out there that would like some historical clarification on the whole Luger-Yoko feud, because this is a pretty intricate story at the time. If you didn't have any knowledge of what the initial plans were for Luger at this point in 93 and subsequently after the show took place, you'd have probably assumed that with the way everything went down here, Vince had completely given up on the Luger character by the time this match ended. And to a certain degree, that is mostly true. And the plan, for those of you that don't know or don't remember, And this has been well documented by most historians, so I'm not breaking any new ground here with what I'm about to say. But this was around the time in the business where Vince had not completely lost his mind, and he actually had long-term story plans for a lot of his top programs 6 months, 8 months to a year in advance. And since they were still in the habit of running the 4 big yearly pay-per-view events, Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam, and Survivor Series, Vince would usually try to tie in stories from one pay-per-view to the other, especially if he wanted to carry something over a series of several events. But the plan was for Luger to win this match in the manner that he did so that they could build to the rematch with him and Yoko for the following year's WrestleMania, which would have been WrestleMania 10. And that was going to be the point where Luger actually beat Yoko to win the belt. But, as we've all come to learn with Vince over the years, it's always a case of him pulling the plug on ideas if he either gets bored with something or he finds a new project to put in its place. Vince soured on things a lot quicker than a lot of other wrestling promoters or bookers have historically. So by the time you get to January of 94, you get the Royal Rumble finish where Bret and Luger are both declared co-winners because they both went out at the same time. And you fast forward to Mania, and even though Luger ends up getting his rematch for the belt with Yokozuna, because you remember they did the whole double main event deal where Yoko defended against Luger first, and then whoever won that match would face Bret in the main event. And I can't remember off the top of my head what they did as a finish for that match. I think they went with some kind of DQ or something to keep the belt on Yoko, and after that point, Luger really never sniffed the title picture ever again after the fact. Vince got bored with him, and Luger kind of mingled in mid-card purgatory until his contract ran out in late summer of 95 before he jumped back to WCW for the Nitro debut. And we'll talk about a couple key spots as we run down the match, but the one thing that immediately hit me at the beginning, once you get past all the stupid national anthem stuff with the Japanese guy and whatever his name was, Aaron Neville, they both sucked. They always do. Anytime someone sings the national anthem for one of these sporting events, about 99% of the time, they all sound like shit because they're lousy musicians. So that was ear-piercing. But getting back to the match, I'm watching Luger make his entrance for this thing, and the first thing that hit me right out of the gate, God, this guy is just not suited for this gimmick. And you could tell it with the facial expressions, man. He looks like Lex Luger playing a character. That's honestly the best way I can describe it. He was not a natural American hero babyface. You could always tell he was uncomfortable in this role, and it just never suited his personality. And, that's not to say that there weren't periods in Luger's career where he wasn't a great babyface. I'm old enough to remember that night he beat Hogan for the title on Nitro, and the guy was over like God. Go back and watch that period from, I guess it would have been late 96 up to the point he beat Hogan for the belt in whatever month that was. I think it was summer or early fall of 97. I remember it was like 6 days out from a pay-per-view because Hogan won the belt right back. But Luger was one of the hottest baby faces during that period. So the guy could pull it off. But God, the white meat American hero Hulk Hogan bootleg that Vince tried to make out of him, it was never going to work. And it showed by the time this night was over. Now, it is important to keep in mind, and I'm not denying this for the time, but there was a large portion of the fans that dug the Luger character. But you also have to understand that just because the crowd likes certain guys, it doesn't mean that their character is a natural fit for the individual working that role, if that makes any sense. I mean, yeah, Luger could pretend to be Hulk Hogan 2.0, but was it visually comparative on television when you look at both of them side by side? Hogan was an inherently charismatic guy, so even if I was never a fan of his personally, I could at least see how people came to love him over the years, because whatever personal demons he dealt with behind the scenes, he was able to mask that when he was just being Hulk Hogan and not Terry Bollea, for lack of better terms. Luger, on the other hand, I never got that vibe from him. He always looked extremely uncomfortable on camera in this gimmick. Anyway, enough about that whole discussion. Let's talk about the match. Yokozuna was the fucking man. Seriously, I never appreciated just how great that guy was back in his heyday. That dude could move. You know, while he certainly didn't have Bam Bam Bigelow agility for a big guy, like, he couldn't do moonsaults or anything like that, but think about that for a second. Like, let's say you're a casual fan that has never seen a Lex Luger or Yokozuna match in your entire life. You look at this match on paper. Someone asks you point blank, who do you think gets gassed first? Most people would probably look at both guys and figure Yoko would be the guy to get blown up first. Oh, how those people would be wrong. And this was not a short match by any stretch. And this thing got almost 20 full minutes. And when I tell you that Yoko carried this whole thing, that is no exaggeration. And again, this is not to discredit Luger in any way, because he definitely held up his end. But after that 5-minute mark, Luger was fucking winded. And it was obvious. You know, meanwhile, you got Yokozuna in there, this giant 500-plus pound behemoth, and he's none the worse for wear. He's calling it. He's making sure they're both in the right place at the right time. It's so fluid. You know, that's not to say it was a perfect match from beginning to end, but considering what you had on paper here, I think a lot of people were dreading this match from the moment they announced this back in the day. But it is easy for people to forget how great of a worker Yokozuna was. And it really wasn't honestly until the tail end of his run a few years later where his body started to break down and his weight ended up being more of a noticeable hindrance. But here in 93, quite the contrary. You know, and again, there were quirky things that happened in this match. A couple of the obvious ones that stand out were pretty much any time Mr. Fuji got involved. There was a spot way early on in the match where Fuji tried to powder Luger in the face behind the ref's back, and not only did he miss entirely, but Luger gave him the what the fuck was that look, and they just kept doing spots like it was an ordinary heel spot you see in every match. And obviously there's the totally botched spot at the finish where Corny's distracting the ref on the apron so Fuji could toss Yoko the bucket, but he just totally whiffs the throw and the bucket almost ends up rolling out to the floor, so poor Yoko had to go chase it. This is not one of Mr. Fuji's stronger showings, and of course that's not the crap on him. I always like Mr. Fuji, but yeah, he wasn't exactly in the prime of his career by this period. And of course the funny thing here is that, you know, while I'm watching Yoko and Luger do their thing, my attention is almost averted to everything that's going on outside the floor with Corny and Fuji. Seriously, if you've never seen this match before, you got to go check it out just to watch some of the stuff Cornette does here. It's hilarious because there are parts in this match where you'll look at Corny pacing around on the floor and he's almost like trying to duck and hide from the camera at various points to make it seem like he's about to do something devious. And then it just never happens. Look, I'm sitting there watching him at various points like, what the hell is this guy doing? There's one point where Luger's on the floor selling and Cornette's on the opposite end of the ring. He's basically crawling on his knees, holding up the racket in the air like he's teasing he's going to try and attack Luger with it. And then he just doesn't. I got a kick out of that. Good old Jim Cornette drawing attention to himself, trying to be the center of the spotlight. Tisk, tisk. But we fast forward a little later on, and that's when they started breaking out all the falls finishes and really milking the close falls. And the crowd was definitely into it. I think they did a little bit of a disservice with all the false finishes, though, by not zooming the camera in more so that we could see the shoulder pop-ups for the 3 count. Like, it's something that works more for a viewer watching at home when we actually see the visual of the guy kicking out. There's more drama to it. Instead of seeing the pin from the hard cam shot, but we don't actually see the guy kick out. But the big spot at the end sees Yoko go up for the bonsai drop, but he ends up missing. Both guys are stirring back to their feet. Yoko tries a charge in the corner, but Luger ducks that. Manages to get a kind of sort of body slam on Yoko, although it really didn't come off all that great. It actually kind of looked similar to the way he slammed him on the USS Intrepid. It's like, he got him up a little bit, but it wasn't It wasn't the full overhead throw. And at that point, Luger manages to lay out Fuji with a punch. He gives Yoko the elbow, which knocks him out to the floor. And while the ref is counting Yoko out, Cornette jumps on the apron and gets the blow from Luger. That is, Luger punched Cornette. He didn't... Yeah, well, never mind. And obviously, this finish is where the stain of this main event renders its ugly head. Because the finish sees Yokozuna lose the match via count out. And all the while, you got Luger in the ring celebrating. The babyfaces are all filing in from the locker room. They're hoisting Luger up onto their shoulders, parading him around the ring. And it's such a surreal, almost anticlimactic moment on the show, because when you're watching this back and you actually take the time to watch the crowd, like at first they're all going nuts. Like they see the confetti drop in, they're throwing babies in the air, everyone's so excited. But then this little parade keeps going, and you start to see it sink in. Oh, wait a minute. Luger won via countout, but since he didn't actually pin Yoko, Yoko keeps the belt. And you start seeing the people slowly drop their heads and start kind of standing there wondering what the fuck's going on. It's, like I said, it's a really surreal moment in a lot of ways. Because in 2022, if people get a finish like this on a pay-per-view, like, they're too smart nowadays. You know, if a babyface won a match via countout, the fans would immediately shit on it because they would realize that the title doesn't change hands on a countout. You know, here in 93, the fans weren't quite smart enough to understand this. They figured it out eventually, but it took them a while to catch on. And, of course, you got Bobby Heenan putting over the story on commentary while Vince is trying to sit there babyfacing the whole thing, and he guarantees that when Luger gets the rematch, this time he'll beat Yoko. And at the time he said it, it was probably true, because, again, that was the initial plan. Luger was going to beat Yoko for the title at the following year's WrestleMania. And then we all found out what the direction was that they ended up going instead. And it's important to note, for those of you that thought the countout win here for Luger wasn't part of the game plan, no. This was the plan. Vince actually thought this was a good idea. To have Luger win this match via countout, not win the strap though. Also, he could build up to Luger winning it on a bigger stage months later. And he thought that people were going to ride that gravy train all the way to the finish line. Turns out even the fans back then were impatient. They don't want to see Luger win the belt 6 months from now. They want to see Luger win the goddamn thing right here, right now while he was white hot. Yeah, this was a failure of epic proportions for all parties involved. Because, I mean, not only did it totally kill Luger's career in the WWF, but it kind of left Yoko floating in the dark until, I guess, January of 94, when they introduced Taker into the equation and started building up to the casket match for the Rumble. You know, Luger got the shorter end of the stick, but, yeah. This was an historical miss. You know, the match itself wasn't even horrendous either. I don't think a lot of people remember the actual match because of how notoriously appalling the finish was, but when you go back and watch the actual work between both guys, it was fine. Once you take out the fact that Luger was gassed less than a quarter of the way in. But, you know, they shot the angle to close out the program too, with Ludwig Borga getting in Luger's face in the locker room, and, you know, they kickstarted that feud right before they faded to black. But, man, even at the ripe age of 6, when I first saw this, I even remember sitting there really disappointed with the finish. It's like, I don't know, because I'm always game for long-term story development when it calls for it, but when I think back to the popularity of Luger at this point and the fact that the fans were really craving to see him win the strap, I don't know. Would it have been wiser to just have Luger beat Yoko for the title here? Yeah, it's not even to say they couldn't have had Yoko win it back like a month or two later, and they could have gone forward with the plans they originally had, but I always wondered if it would have been better to just have Luger win the thing here and drop it back a couple months later. Why not? It's always easy to fantasy book after the fact once you see how everything actually unfolds, but this one just seemed way too easy to screw up. Somehow I'm not surprised, though, because Vince has a track record of doing this exact thing when it comes to booking. I mean, Vince was known for being good at a lot of things in the business, but booking, that was not one of his stronger showings. So, as we go back and grade the show overall, I don't know. I still maintain that the show totally fell off a cliff by the time we got to the Lawler-Brett segment, but would I agree with the mass that this would be ranked among the all-time worst SummerSlams? I don't know. It certainly wasn't a great SummerSlam overall, but I wasn't bored, and there were still some good things on it. It might be one of those shows that actually stacks up well by comparison because of how fucking awful the product is today, and even if it was bad for the time, I don't know, when I compare it to a lot of the garbage I seen being dished out today, I'd go back and watch this show in a heartbeat. Do you need to go out of your way to watch the thing in full? I'd probably say no, but I'd at least recommend you go back and check out the Steiners Heavenly Bodies match. That and for Bobby Heenan's commentary. Alright, so here's the deal with this NWA pay-per-view. I said I was going to review it, and I essentially said that depending on how good or bad both nights were for the show, that I was going to determine whether or not I was going to keep reviewing the power shows going forward. And I'll just say this before we get into the cards for both nights. There was no reason this had to be a 6+ hour event. Obviously, that accounts for nights 1 and 2. Really, in a lot of ways, there's no reason this needed to be a 2-night event, period. But, especially when you factor in the card and the lackluster build anyway. Seriously, why were both nights about 3 hours plus? Now, granted, I skipped through a handful of things in that 3-hour span to savor time, but trust me when I say it really didn't make the show feel any less shorter. Yeah, I know this is sort of NWA's most important event they run every year, but still, dude, I'm over this whole 2-night, 3-hour plus grind to try to get through these pay-per-views. I liked it better back in the day when everything was like 2.5 hours. They got in and out with everything, and I could just move on with my life. That was also back when there were actual stars in the business. Anyway, we're going to run down the card for both shows. I'll spend about as much time as I can muster to comment on what I saw. Some things I'll spend more time on than others, but let's just get into it. And I'll let you know by the end what my current status is with the NWA product after the fact, as if this intro isn't already enough of a teaser. It opened with Smashing Pumpkins dubbed over an opening promo package, which I skipped over because I think Billy Corgan singing is trash, and I always have. So that was a good easy 2 minutes to skip right over. Sorry to all of you out there that actually enjoy Corgan's vocals for whatever reason. But the actual event opened with Nick Aldis coming out, dressed in a suit, and well, after several weeks of unanswered questions and us pondering what the reason was for Corgan pulling Aldis out of the world title match with Trevor, well, we got our answer here. Kinda. And the answer? Plans change. Yeah, that was pretty much the validation we got. He basically came out to do the company welcome promo where he talked about his entire journey over the last year, walking into last year's NWA 73 event as the World's Heavyweight Champion, and now he spent the last 12 months trying to work his way back to the title. Also, he could win a number one contenders match, and then Billy Corgan stripped him away from that championship match because reasons. Reasons that we still don't know about and probably never will unless we read about it in the dirt sheet somewhere down the road. And he cut a great promo here. Covered a lot of ground and mentioned the legacy of the world title. He talked about his wife Mickey a couple times and told the fans to appreciate what she did last year with the NWA Empowerment pay-per-view. To which I snidely remarked, what, book herself to go over in a match and then have a bunch of women have mediocre to passable matches that people were made to pay to see? Yeah, that show. It's a distant memory at this point. And I did review that show, by the way, so you can go back and listen to it if you so desire. But yeah, that was pretty much all he was there to do. And then he hyped up his match with Flip Gordon for the following night. And when it was over, we still had no idea what the whole controversy was with him and Billy Corgan that forced him to pull Aldis out of the world title match. It's a lingering question. So our opener was Mims Wrestling EC3, who was apparently still running this mystery Control Your Narrative project with, I think Braun Strowman is one of the other guys he's been working with. I've obviously heard a little bit about the whole CYN operation, but as far as I know, it's one of those underground projects that's yet to really take off in any significant manner. I assume they've run shows between the time it launched and now. I mean, Lord knows anyone's been talking about it, but yeah, I guess the NWA is trying to do some cross-promotional work to maybe get them off the ground. And I've been an EC3 fan before. Nothing against the guy. Not sure if I buy the whole essential character moniker he's trying to run with. But yeah, I remember when he debuted in TNA as Dixie Carter's spoiled nephew or whatever it was, and he was Ethan Carter III. It's funny because he got picked up by WWE a few years later, and he kept the name EC3, but they never actually acknowledged what the acronym stood for. Of course, we all know how things went for him in WWE once Vince got a hold of him. I honestly don't even remember him being a very integral part of NXT before he got called up, but yeah. Kid obviously has a great look, and he's always been a solid promo. I always liked EC3, but you know, his career always seemed to hit a glass ceiling that he was never able to break through. And I mean, he's a young guy, but he's not necessarily 25 years old anymore either. The match between the two was all right. Again, not much to go off of in terms of story because we haven't seen Mims in weeks, and EC3, I don't think he's ever made a physical appearance on a single episode of Power, so it was kind of just a cold match with little forethought put into it. Much of it was built around EC3 working over Mims' shoulder, which, according to Tim Storm, was injured in that match. What match, you ask? I have no idea. According to Storm, though, it was that one match that Mims injured his shoulder in. Very good attention to detail. By the way, I didn't mention this, but I dug Mims' tribute to the Nation of Domination gimmick with the singlet. And the finish was EC3 hitting Mims with the 1%er, which is his version of the front face DDT. And then he locked in a hold and got Mims to tap out. And he did a promo afterwards where he said something between the fact that he was somewhat blown up after the fact and he was dropping a lot of cryptic WWE scripted verbiage. It was hard to gather what he was really talking about. I think his main point was that the NWA pays homage to the past because it's comfortable in conforming, but you have to focus on the future because the future gets to control their narrative or something, which is a byproduct of why the business sucks anymore, but I'm not going to get into that. But I am starting to gather there's a reason the COIN project hasn't really taken off. It sounds very AEW-ish. Let's let the boys book their own segments and determine their own outcomes without someone with an actual good mind for the business giving them any intellect. Basically telling them their marks and they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, that booking is going extremely well with AEW right now. I can only imagine how dandy things are with EC3's project if he's letting everyone control and book their own shit. So, yeah, one match into the show, and we've put over a guy from outside the company who's working on a vanity project. So after this, got to save some time by fast-forwarding, because the next match was the Ill-Begotten versus the Miserably Faithful, which at the highest compliment, I can merely say it's two slapstick teams having a comedy match that would barely pass on WWE programming. However, because I'm not a nice guy and I don't appreciate bad comedy on my wrestling shows, I just decided to do them a solid and jump ahead so we didn't have to hurt anyone's feelings. Next match was Odinson versus Chris Adonis. Again, I ask, how did this match come about? Why are these two fighting? What is their beef with each other? And more importantly, who was the face and heel going in? I mean, we found out by the end, but still. Moreover, I'm still wondering what the hell happened to Odison's tag partner. Wasn't he teaming with, what's his name? The other big guy. I know, that really boils it down. Well, regardless, it's another cold match between two guys that apparently needed a pay-per-view spot. Wasn't bad or anything. You know, Adonis is about as exciting to watch as curdling milk, but both guys worked hard. Odinson actually hit a really cool-looking reverse spring elbow at one point. One of the highlights, if you even want to call it that, was the one point during the match where Velvet asked Galley and Storm what the deal was with Odinson's gimmick that he puts in his mouth before his matches. And no joke, Joe Galley responded by saying, "It's his purpose." Was that an innuendo that went completely over my head, or am I just overthinking it? Regardless, the finish sucked about 10 cocks. What happens is, Adonis hits Odinson with a spine buster for a pretty good near fall, and while Adonis gets back to his feet, Odinson crawls over to the corner to grab his little can of whatever in the hell it was. I think the announcer said it was hairspray. I had no idea Odinson was all of a sudden a gay hairdresser. But Adonis ends up getting him in the master lock, and while Odinson is struggling in the hold, he is also simultaneously flailing the hairspray can in the air. The ref is looking right at it. Does he try to grab the can from Odinson? No, he just stands there and doesn't care. And that allows for Odinson to spray Adonis in the face. And then the ref called for a DQ. And then to cap it off, Odinson clocked him in the side of the head with the can, which apparently was either made of iron or metal because it was enough to knock Adonis out cold. So, yeah, that was that segment. I didn't have a problem with the DQ finish necessarily. I just didn't give a shit about it because A, I had no idea who the face and heel was beforehand, and B, there was absolutely no build to this, so I had no reason to care about the DQ finish. After this, we had Kerry Morton and Homicide for the Junior Heavyweight Championship, which I vaguely remember them talking about on the Power Show a time or two. I've seen a little bit of Kerry's work, but I haven't gotten too much exposure to him for the short while he's been in the business. You know, obviously he's been training with his dad, so that's a good sign. And no doubt Ricky's teaching him all the good habits he needs to know. And if I'm being entirely objective, this was probably the first good quality pay-per-view thing I've seen up to this point on the show. Was it a perfect match? No. But the match at least had a clear-cut face and heel. Kerry's obviously very green, but he had a good dance partner to work with there in Homicide. He's got ring experience. He's a veteran of the business that knows what he's doing. And, he was able to guide Kerry along in this match pretty well. This might have actually been Kerry's first real pay-per-view spot that I know of, so there was already a lot of pressure on him going in. And I thought he did really well. He's definitely got that Ricky Morton instinct when it comes to the selling aspect of things. I think he could have done a little more at times. It did have the feeling that they were focusing a little too much on the moves and the transitions as opposed to letting things flow more naturally like an old school NWA match. An example that immediately comes to mind, they do this great spot where Homicide gives Kerry a body slam on the floor, and they draw attention to the fact that there's concrete underneath the padding, but fast forward like a minute later and Kerry's already back in the ring hitting moves and starting a comeback. Their sequences generally look good. Kerry was a little tentative at times, but they hit every spot they tried. Kerry got a nice series of near falls at some points. The finish felt a little rushed. Homicide ended up giving a low blow to Kerry, which the ref kind of sort of plainly saw. And while he's admonishing Homicide, Kerry's stirring up to his feet in the corner, ends up scooping Homicide up onto his shoulders for the running fireman's carry roll that Fit Finlay used to do. And this is where I thought they rushed the sequence a little too fast, because Kerry does a moonsault off the top rope, lands perfectly on his feet, but Homicide is already back on his feet after the fireman's carry move, and then he immediately hooks Kerry on the second rope and hits a cutter for the 3. That entire sequence I ran down happened probably within 30 to 45 seconds. Just, I don't know, it had too much of an indie feel of we got to get our shit in. So, wasn't a big fan of the timing and pacing of some of the spots. But generally, this is a strong showing for Kerry Morton. Mad props to him. Hopefully the kid continues to work hard and gain good habits because he seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders. As long as he doesn't get suckered into hanging out with all the outlaw goofs, I think he's got a strong career ahead of him. That is until AEW signs him and they end up burying him into oblivion like they did with Brian Pillman Jr. So at this point, they brought out Wildfire Tommy Rich for a special appearance. And the NWA always does a good job with the legends for these shows. It was really good to see Tommy Rich again. Unfortunately, he was a little ahead of my time as a kid. I really didn't get a whole lot of exposure to Memphis wrestling at a young age. And, by the time I got to see him in WCW, it was during the Jim Herd era of the product where things were pretty hit and miss. By that point, he wasn't even really pushed as a main eventer anyway. I think that was also during the era where WCW was intentionally trying to draw back on a lot of the veterans to push a lot of the influx of new names that showed up around that point. So, yeah, Tommy Rich almost immediately fell to the back burner by the time he showed up. And what year was that? Was that late 88, maybe 89? He's still a hell of a promo. Certainly knows how to live up to his Wildfire moniker because he got these people fired the fuck up. But, yeah, really great to see him. What wasn't great to see was Thrillbilly Mason in the transvestite. He ain't no Adrian Street. That's all I'm going to say about that. Matt Cardona then had a comedy match with Rolando Friedman after killing about 3 minutes of airtime with another promo segment. Looking back, I'm thinking they could have easily shaved off an hour of the show right there if they'd have just cut back on all the unnecessary talking. And for those of you curious, Rolando Friedman is Rush Friedman's kayfabe older brother. The guy's about the size of Adam Cole with a less impressive head of hair. I know this is politically incorrect to say, so I'll probably catch fire for it, but the guy's basically an inch or two away from being declared a midget, legally. He's basically NWA's version of Gilbert, except Dwayne Gill at least had talent and was over. And I determined at this point that if this took place as a heat angle on Power to build up to something else for a pay-per-view, I'd probably be fine watching it. But when this is taking place on a show where they're asking me to pay to see it, I immediately say, no, fuck you. So this is about another 5 minutes I skipped over to save some time and energy. I have no idea what happened here, nor do I really care. Up next, we had the Burke Invitational Gauntlet to determine who Camille would be facing for the Women's World title on Night 2. It started with Kylan King and Samantha Starr. No relation. Samantha Starr is a rather hefty lady who I had never seen prior to this match before. And all of a sudden, she's in a match where she gets to earn a title shot if she wins. This seems like hot shot booking to me. She was also randomly and unexplainably accompanied by Baby Doll, who's even heftier and bigger than Samantha was. And I like Baby Doll, but she's seen better days. Natalia Markova came out third. I think it was during this stage of the match where Samantha Starr went in to break up a pinfall attempt for whatever reason. And after pulling Natalia off, she fell right on her ass. We had Misa Kate coming out fourth. She did some slightly more impressive stuff than either Natalia or Samantha did, but she also almost immediately got eliminated by Kylan, so oh well. And it was also at this point where I determined that apparently this match was pinfall, submission, and over-the-top rolls as well. Would have been good to know that going in. Out next we had Maddie, just Maddie, which might be the best gimmick name of 2022. I forget, what was her name before? Wasn't it some really elaborate last name that no one could pronounce? And then they just dropped it. Now she's Maddie. But she also contributed to the random, unexplained breaking up of pinfall attempts in an elimination match, which is one of the most baffling parts of the whole thing to me. Coming out after that was Taryn Terrell, which normally I like to apply the Taryn Terrell social distance rule by skipping through all of her segments after that abomination of a match she had last year where she exposed the business. But seeing as how she was kind of just a body amongst a sea of women, it didn't bother me as much. The highlight of the match for me was right as soon as Max the Impaler came out, and while she is coming down the aisle, Maddie leapt over the top rope and ran to the back like a coward. And Kyle Davis, who had been calling the eliminations in the match, casually says, "Maddie has eliminated herself." Thought that was funny. You know, why not just totally bury her and say, Maddie is a coward and doesn't give a shit about the match? That would have been even funnier. Obviously, I've had a lot of good things to say about Max the Impaler. Her only downside is that she really doesn't have a lot of ring exposure, so she's very green. And even though I'm not really a big fan of her aligning with James Mitchell and by association, the fucking miserably faithful goofball act, she's got a very unique look. She definitely stands out in the women's division, and her being in there with all these girls actually made her the center of attention because she's so different from everyone else. You know, she was a little reckless at times with her power moves, and at one point she slammed Kylan on top of one of the girls. I think it was Natalia, and basically dumped Kylan right on top of her face and neck. Ugh. Bad times. But Max ended up cleaning house to set up Tootie Lynn coming out. And they kind of did the David Goliath face-off for a minute, which was fine. Even though she got eliminated off camera while Angelina Love made her entrance, and they didn't show a replay of it. It was also at the point where Angelina had a face-off with Max, where I realized after all these years, Angelina is still way too fucking skinny. I mean, I remember complaining how thin she was over a decade ago in TNA, and somehow in that 10-year time span, she has still apparently never heard of a cheat meal once in a blue moon. The final entrant for the match was Genocide. Somewhere in this mess, Max eliminated Taryn and Angelina at the same time. Boiled down to Max, Kylan, Natalia, and Genocide, wherein during the final four, there is a spot where Genocide hit a pretty cool looking spine buster to Max at one point, goes for a pinfall attempt, which was once again broken up in an elimination match. Seriously, this pissed me off at this point. This is at least the fourth time that happened in this match where girls are breaking up falls for no discernible reason. Can we please get a fucking talent agent in this company with a clue? Please and thank you. Anyway, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. The match came down to Max and Natalya. They exchanged some stuff back and forth. Natalya actually had some pretty good elbow forearms at one point. Looked better than anything I've ever seen Jon Moxley do, that's for sure. And finally, Natalya tried to go up top for a move, but got press slammed off. And then Max hit her over-the-shoulder backbreaker drop and got the 3. So she earned the title shot for night 2, which we'll cover a little later on. I've seen worse gauntlets. That's kind of all I have to say about it. It existed. Most of the girls in there were fine, but is it something you need to go out of your way to watch, much less pay to see? No, not really. Next, we had Scion and Jax Dane for the National Heavyweight Championship. I'm sorry, not just Scion, the Masked Scion, in case that already wasn't apparent. This was also the point in the show where Tim Storm actually lost his voice and had a great bit of trouble calling the rest of the action. Poor guy. And this whole thing actually kind of went off the rails in a hurry. This was... Well, here's basically what I determined after watching how this all went down. I think what happened was they were putting the show together and someone had to step out to take a leak, so they put Vince Russo in charge of booking this one particular match on the show while the guy stepped out of the room. And we all know what happens when you give Russo creative liberty to do whatever the fuck he wants. All hands on deck. Here's the essential nutshell summary of what I saw. It begins with a Jax Dane jump attack where he's basically mauling Scion for several minutes, just pounding on him, having his way with him, the whole 9 yards. And at some point in this fight, Jax Dane rolls out to the floor and decides that he's had enough of this fight and he wants to leave. So he picks up his belt and starts heading up the aisleway with some guy. I guess it's his manager. No idea who it was, nor do I care. And of course, Scion cuts him off at the pass to throw him back in the ring. And while this is happening, the referee is on the floor jaw-jacking in the aisleway with Austin Idol and the other manager. Also, Crimson could sneak over the barricade from the hard cam, get into the ring, and chokeslam Jax Dane. And it's one thing for Crimson to have chokeslammed Jax Dane behind the ref's back and then quickly leave so that he could not see him interfere. What made this whole thing more ridiculous is that the ref plainly saw Crimson interfering and laying out Jax Dane with a chokeslam. He looked right at it. So does he call for the bell? Nope. He simply walks back to the ring and he continues calling the match like nothing ever happened. Like we didn't just see this giant man in a red jersey hit the ring and lay a guy out with a wrestling move. No, this match is perfectly fine to continue. I take it was no DQ then. Or these people are just idiots and didn't think it through all the way. Oh, but it gets better. Because after Crimson lays out Jax with a chokeslam, Scion gets back into the ring and he begins contemplating whether or not to pin Jax. Because, I don't know, I guess he's stupid. Despite the fact that he recently turned heel on the power shows, but no, he still wants to do the right thing. What a bad heel he is. Yeah, Crimson lays the guy out and Scion refuses to cheat. because, heels don't cheat or anything. By the way, great run-in for Crimson. Glad that totally served a purpose. So, of course, Scion gets back in the ring. Jax Dane gives him basically a spine buster. And the ref slides in, and he counts 1. He counts 2. And then Scion kicks out. So not only was Crimson's run-in spot completely and totally pointless, but the deal of Jax Dane taking advantage after the distraction was also completely pointless. Seriously, this is straight out of the Russo playbook. Completely pointless run-in angles that lead to absolutely nothing and are just there for the sake of being there. So they continue to wrestle. There's a spot where Scion had Dane in a sleeper hold, which Dane tapped to, but the ref was distracted with something. I have no idea. He was either picking his nose, scratching his ass, or just being a fucking moron. And after about 60 run-in angles, several false finishes, a visual submission spot, several spots where a DQ should have been called but was not, the finish is Scion hitting Jax Dane with a fireman's carry and winning the belt anyway. Flatter than a pancake. Clusterfuck. Complete and total clusterfuck, I wrote down. This sucked many cocks. What did not suck on the show, however, Bully Ray. There were very few things that were over like wildfire on this show, but there were 2 things beyond a shadow of a doubt that were over on both nights. Bully Ray and tables. While I know Bully's had a fairly spotty track record in the last several years, I've been a big fan of his for as long as I can remember. I mean, we made a couple TNA references earlier on, but there was a period where Bully Ray was actually one of my favorite guys in that company. He got himself in shape, he broke out on his own and got over as a singles guy, and I think he actually ended up winning the world title at one point, am I right? I mean, he absolutely revolutionized his career, and probably at the time where the people were least expecting it. Because that whole singles run, I mean, that didn't happen during the peak of Bully's career. Granted, he wasn't over the hill necessarily, but he wasn't exactly a young lion at that stage either. Anyway, he had a tables match with Mike Knox, as advertised. A rivalry that apparently dates back to, speaking of TNA references, Aces and Eights. The single worst company storyline in history, and Lord Almighty, when you think back to all the crappy TNA storylines they've culminated over the years, that is saying something. God, I hated that storyline. What a total disaster and botched angle that was. A fucking lackluster biker gang faction with a bunch of job guys who never won matches and always got their ass kicked by the TNA locker room at every turn. Nobody benefited from it. Everyone came out the worse for wear and didn't elevate anyone's career after the fact. In fact, if I recall correctly, I think the majority of them ended up getting released from their contracts after the fact. Wasn't Eric Bischoff's dorky son a part of that faction? My God, remember they tried ramming that guy down everyone's throat on TV? Anyway, I sort of half-heartedly paid attention to this. No offense to Bully Ray here, but I've about had it with the whole garbage match thing in wrestling, and while this certainly wasn't as offensive as, say, an AEW deathmatch version of the hardcore thing where guys are slaughtering each other with barbed wire and opening up arteries with fishing knives, it was also a tables match, and I always thought the concept of the tables match was kind of dumb. Never mind that it's not even a stable of the NWA when it comes to match stipulations, but the whole concept of the only way to win is by putting a guy through a table. I mean, at one point in the business it may have worked, but that was also back when guys didn't kick out at going through flaming tables or getting backdrop off of ladders through fucking barbed wire boards. But, in 2022, after all the crap we've seen guys go through in weapons matches, I don't know. To me, it's just kind of silly. Bully won. The people pop for it, so... there is still a subset of fans out there that really like this modern hardcore garbage. I think a lot of people are burnt out on it, but, as long as it gets a pop from the subset of the fan base, they're going to keep running with it. Obviously, Bully is over with the people, too, so that kind of helped. Over with everyone except Velvet Sky. Because, let's just say they have a checkered past. And we had one of the more unintentionally funny moments from both nights. The match is Hawks Aerie versus La Rebellion for the tag titles. And if you've been following the show, you would know that the previous champs were Doug Williams and Harry Smith. No longer, however, because apparently due to illness, as we were told from Kyle Davis, Williams and Smith were being stripped of the belts, and now this match is being decided to determine the new champion since the previous champions could not fulfill their obligations of defending them on pay-per-view. See, Tony? It can be done. You don't need to do all the interim champion bullshit. Guy can't defend his belt? Great. You're no longer the champion. Best of luck to you. It is kind of funny to me, though. Doug Williams and Harry Smith were no longer the best company or the best tag team in the company because someone came down with a cold. Very goofy to me. Anyway, the match itself was mostly fine. Kind of telegraphed with the finish, considering we haven't seen Luke or PJ Hawks on the show in God knows how long. Yet somehow they were being put in this spot to determine new champions. La Rebellion had been doing the segments with OGK on the Power Show, so kind of made sense that they went over here. The wrestling from both teams was pretty good. Hawks Aerie got some nice shine early on. Damien Say ran some interference on the floor for the distraction so La Rebellion could take over. Heels worked over Luke Hawx for a while. I still don't really understand the psychology of the father-son duo where the dad is the one selling so that the son can get the hot tag, but, PJ actually has some good selling facials on the apron. But PJ ended up making a great little fiery comeback. He did a deadlift suplex to Mecha Wolf at one point that looked really impressive. You ever take a look at PJ's stature, he's not necessarily a bulky guy. But he ended up whiffing a cross-body dive onto both guys like a minute later, so... Well, the Rock and Roll Express had their off days too, so what can you do? There's a spot at the end where La Rebellion hit their Mark of the Beast powerbomb backbreaker combo on Luke for an ear fall. Probably the first time I've actually ever seen them execute that move correctly. And the finish was good. Mecha Wolf ended up yanking PJ off the apron, and while the ref was turned to him, Damien spat the red mist in Luke's face from the opposite corner. Mecha did a dive to take out PJ on the floor, and then Bestia rolled up Luke for the 3. It was a wrestling match. Everything they did looked fine. No real complaints about the spots or anything. Good old school NWA match with a proper heat finish. The whole situation with Williams and Smith doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me with them being stripped of the belts last minute. Unless the guy's actually injured, which, in that case, why didn't you just tell us that up front? But, yeah, this is pretty good. Following that was yet another talk segment that would have been perfectly fitted for an episode of Power before making people pay to see the actual match. They had a Tyrus Trevor Murdoch face-off to, I guess, garner some last-minute heat for the actual title match the following night. And, the segment itself was good. Tyrus is a hell of a promo. Trevor did a hell of a promo. What did he call himself here? Two-strap Tyrus. Thought that was kind of funny. I also laughed at the line in here where he said, "I'm in the best shape of my life." And there were a handful of people in the crowd that began mocking him with some hard belly laughs. That was also funny. And Trevor basically fired back with saying he decides whether or not Tyrus shows up on Gutfeld with a black eye, and the only gold he'll be carrying is the chains he has around his neck. It was a good face-off. My only problem with it is that it aired 24 hours before the actual title match after people had already paid for the event. I mean, I know the people that were going to buy the show were going to buy it regardless of the build, but I just wonder how much it would have increased pay-per-view buys if they would have done this exact same segment on the studio show a few weeks before the actual match. My guess is they were probably trying to kill a little more time before the main event, because I don't think they were going to give Camille and Taya Valkyrie 45 minutes, nor would I have recommended they did. But yes, the main event for night one was the Women's World Title match. Probably Taya's biggest NWA match to date. And I can't remember how many times I've talked about this, but it's always good to reiterate talking points for new viewers. I've heard a lot of good things about Taya Valkyrie, and while I tend to dispute what the mass public agrees on because most of the time it's all bullshit, I mean, even Jim Cornette has had nothing but good things to say about Taya. The problem for me is that I really didn't watch TNA at the point that she was working there, and when she got signed to WWE, they barely ever used her. So, to me, it was always conjecture. Like, well, people say she's good, so it might be true, but what standards are we operating on? You know, I've never really got to see her on a big enough platform or a high-profile match to judge one way or the other. So, I made sure I paid attention here, because this was really the first Taya Valkyrie match I've gotten to watch on a big stage where she was the center of attention. And I'll say this. Her stuff looked really damn good. I mean, she hits hard, she lays her stuff in, but it also looks completely safe and convincing. She had some great elbow and forearm blows. You know, her rope running is on point. Her basics are very smooth. I could definitely see why a lot of people are high on her. And the other thing I like about her is that she's got some size, you know, so when she's in there working with a bigger girl like Camille, it doesn't look visually phony. And obviously when I say big, I don't mean fat. I mean big as in tall, body mass, I guess you could say. Because Camille is easily 6 feet and maybe even a little above that, but Taya's only about an inch or two shorter, so when she's on offense, it looks believable. And you know, they were obviously calling a lot of stuff here on the spot, which is fine. They were in the right place at the right time for pretty much everything they did. I like Taya's facials and how she lets things simmer before she goes to the next spot. They actually had one of the more believable looking forearm exchange standoffs I've seen in a long time, both for men and women's matches. You know, they worked it like a main event caliber match. I definitely argue this was the best Camille match I've ever seen. You know, had some really good false finishes at the end there. I will say, my one complaint about this match, if I had one, Camille broke out the Canadian Destroyer at one point. God damn it, I hate that move with every fiber of my being. If I ever see anybody use a Canadian Destroyer ever again, it'll be too soon. That move needs to be retired, taken out behind the barn, and shot in the head and never to be spoken of again. But they built up to the ref bump at the end where Taya accidentally speared him. Ended up giving Camille a series of face stomps into the mat. They had a really nice near fall where Taya gave Camille a belt shot and got a fantastic 2 3/4 fall out of it. And the big climax at the end was Camille getting out of a chicken wing attempt. Both girls gave each other headbutts. And while they were stunned, they had a great finish where Taya tried to charge Camille but got hit with a spear Randy Orton style out of nowhere. Thought that was a good finishing sequence. You know, it didn't get quite the pop that I expected. More so, I'd say I got a golf clap in a lot of ways. But this was an extremely good women's match. And I know that's always grading on a curve when we're dealing with the girls' matches because, you know, as much as people are going to hate hearing this, yes, everyone, it's okay. And this is not misogynistic, so you can bite me if you think it is. The reality is that you have to grade on a curve when you're discussing men and women's wrestling because they're two entirely different domains, very different standards. But, I'd go as far as to say I enjoyed this more than the Kylan King match at the last NWA show, and that was a really strong women's match too. Camille really knows how to deliver on the big shows, and while Taya was definitely calling a lot of this match, Camille held up her end very well. It takes two to tango. It's always important to remember that. So, hats off to both girls here. Very, very good match. Easily the best match on night one, no question. They definitely earned that main event slot. So as we move on to night two here, we'll kind of approach everything with the same format by running down the card and talking about whatever I saw. There were things that I skipped over for the record. I was not about to watch another full 3.5 hour pay-per-view with an entire card, mostly built around makeshift matches. Again, I revert back to what I said at the very beginning. There's no reason this show needed to be 2 nights, but can't do anything about it now. It opened with a 2 out of 3 falls match with Colby Carino and Caprice Coleman. And I'm actually a fan of Colby's work, so I took the time to actually watch this. Even though I've never seen any physical appearance from Caprice on any of the power shows, I've seen him on AEW with Kevin Kelly calling Ring of Honor matches, but not so much in the NWA. And I thought this match was good. Colby's actually a pretty good heat magnet. Very underrated in a lot of ways. And the more I watch him, the more I realize, this guy would have fit in real well in the territories if he were like 3 to 4 inches taller. But they did a lot of good stuff here. Basically played up the story early on where Colby submitted very quickly to an arm wringer, so Caprice had to immediately let go. So that put him up 1-0, but Colby didn't have any damage done to his arm. And that followed for them to build up to a spot a few minutes later where Colby pulled out a work gimmick from his tights and hit Caprice over the head with it to tie things up at the second fall. And by the way, when I say worked gimmick, I mean phantom gimmick, because it was totally obvious that Colby didn't actually have anything stored in his trunk, so it's an old school heel tactic. But Colby worked over Caprice for a while. He did some fun bantering on the floor with some of the geeks in the front row. And I'll say this, I spent time putting over Colby in this match, but I thought Caprice was really good here too. I haven't seen too many of his matches before. I know he used to team with Cedric Alexander in Ring of Honor years back, but a lot of the previous stuff I've seen from him, it's mostly been commentary. But I thought both guys gelled really well together. They had a great finish here that almost kind of looked like a botch, but I don't know, they pulled it off so well, I just figured it was part of the deal. But Caprice tries to give Colby one of those running Hurricane Ranas off the top rope, but Caprice ended up kind of slipping while he was attempting to leap up to pull Colby down. But Colby had his hands clutched on the top rope, so they were playing it up on commentary like Colby held onto the ropes, which I kind of dug. It was a fucking brutal landing for poor Caprice, but, he got back up on his feet, so he was fine, obviously, but he looked like he was dead. And Colby took advantage with a running knee off the top rope and hit his cool little finishing Saito suplex pin to win the series 2-1. Very strong opener. Both guys worked hard. Crowd was into it. I think Colby's got something, man. He's, I don't know. He's got that Austin Aries punchable face where the guy is such a phenomenal douchebag, but you also can't take away from the fact that he's also a very gifted athlete. Kind of like the mid to late 90s Shawn Michaels, but the reason I use Aries as an example is that I'm still not convinced that Colby isn't Aries' bastard son from another dimension. The facial resemblance is too paralleled. So, yeah, strong opener. The next couple matches were ones that I skipped over due to personal time constraints and the fact that I really didn't figure I was going to miss anything by skipping them. Up next was a multi-person over-the-top rope tag battle royal that I passed on. A, because I really didn't have any desire to watch a clusterfuck of bodies do a bunch of choreographed spots. And B, more than 80% of these teams I could honestly care less about. So that was an easy fast forward for me. If you happen to watch this show and I missed something earth-shattering in this match, please inform me. And I also skipped over the Jake Dumas match because, as I've said before, I do not like goofy undercard comedy characters on a wrestling show that I'm supposed to take remotely seriously. I have seen a handful of Jake Dumas segments. Most of them I've either categorized as bad or modern wrestling comedy or WWF 80s cartoon comedy. Either way, not my flavor. Never has been, and I do not dig this stuff. I was very hesitant to skip over the next match. However, because Davey Richards was in it, and I've always enjoyed Davey's work from back in the day, I wanted to give this a shot because I don't think I've seen a Davey Richards match since, oh God. Well, I know he was in Ring of Honor in the late 2000s, and he was pushed as the top singles guy at one point, but correct me if I'm wrong, didn't he and Eddie Edwards work in TNA for a brief period? Before Eddie went completely batshit insane and started doing all the garbage wrestling, and Davey ended up leaving the wrestling business for a period of time to go to school. So, it's been a hot minute, and I know Davey recently came back to the business after time off. He's apparently been working some MLW dates. He looks fantastic. Always had a great intense look to him. Even though the height thing was always going to be a hindrance for him. He always reminded me of guys like Roderick Strong, where he has a smaller, thinner frame, but the guy at least looks like a grown adult that I can buy as someone who could believably kick someone's teeth in. There aren't too many of those guys out there, but Davey is one of them. So he ended up wrestling that Thrill Billy Mason guy that did that promo from the previous night, the fat outlaw-looking guy with a transvestite standing next to him, as eye candy, I guess, if you're into that sort of thing. I don't know, nor do I care. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole. Not the guy I would have put in there with Davey on an NWA event, but I'm not also the hired booker. And the match went pretty much how I figured it would once I saw both guys standing across the ring from each other. Davey's shit looked great. Anything he did got a giant reaction because the guy's actually over and the people respect him. And the fat guy looked like every untrained green indie geek you've ever seen. It was way too competitive for my taste, given Davey's level of ring experience. Unless he was going to go in there and wrestle someone that's been around the business as long as Davey has, there's no reason that Davey should have been selling for as long as he did here. The finish was absolute dreck because they had to try and be cute with involving the guy in drag. They should have ended it after Davey hit that great double foot stomp off the top rope, but instead they had the guy kick out so they could do a crappy finish with Mason knocking the drag guy off the apron, pulling his wig off in the process, and then Davey tapped him out with an ankle lock. Stupid. Good to see Davey again, though. I don't really know what his career status is at this point or how much longer he really wants to do this, but I don't know. The guy can go. He seems like he at least has a couple more peak years ahead of him. I'd love to see him do some interpromotional work with some of the top guys in the business today, like Dax and Cash and AEW. Some of the actual guys on that roster that we take seriously and give a crap about. At least Davey has experience and he wouldn't make a joke out of it. Just something I was thinking about here. Of course, with Davey, he probably looks at what's going on over there and says, I don't want any part of that, brother. Then we had a marriage proposal from Joe Galley that I glossed over. I can make a joke, but I'm not even going to do that for time purposes. Good for him, though. I wish him all the best. What I did not skip over was J.J. Dillon and Barry Windham. It's, so weird. We're going back in the archives and watching these classic NWA shows in real time for the Friday podcast, and you see J.J. Dillon almost every week on those studio shows, and you fast forward to 2022, and that guy's still living life to the fullest. Of course, JJ is still cutting fantastic promos, just like it was 1986 all over again. I'll tell you this. If you don't take anything away from my review here, I really encourage you to hone in on what I'm about to say, because this is actually a pretty eye-opening promo in a lot of ways. Because contextually, a surface level breakdown of it is that he basically said, the wrestling fans are the reason that the business is alive and thriving today. And while we can certainly have the discussion on what actually passes for good wrestling these days, it's few and far between, let's be frank. There is something to be said about the fact that after 70 plus years, there's still these kinds of wrestling fans out there that exist. Honest to God, old school fans that grew up watching the territories, grew up watching classic content and appreciating a time in the business where it was taken seriously and the people actually respected and protected it. It's a very polarizing divide that we have in today's business with the fan base. But it is refreshing as I go back and watch both nights for the show and I looked out into the crowd and saw the people watching. Even if I wasn't a particular fan of everything on the shows, and there were definitely some modernized aspects of the wrestling business that I hate, it is good to know that there are fans out there that still genuinely respect the legacy of the National Wrestling Alliance, and they're going out of their way to support the brand. Again, it's very niche. It's, well, kind of what it is at this stage. I don't even know if all these fans would say they enjoyed everything they saw on both shows, but the one thing I do know, those people value the importance of an NWA in 2022. And as long as there's a subset of people out there that still believe in wrestling tradition, that's enough to give me hope. It's why I value Jim Cornette's opinion so much, despite what some people may say on the internet about him, or even the way people misinterpret my opinion when I name drop him on shows. Those people are ill-informed, ignorant, and they don't know any better. But, I've also come to learn that those kind of people don't care either. So it's not even worth getting angry about because they're just going to remain ignorant for the rest of their lives. But this is a very good promo from JJ. And it's one that I think people will end up overlooking in the grand scheme of things, which is kind of a shame because there was a lot of important material in this message. I don't know if I'd recommend you go out of your way to buy the show just to see this JJ promo, but take my word for it. There was a lot of important stuff in there. Up next was the Anthony Mayweather-Sion match for the National Heavyweight title, which Sion just won the previous night. And of course, now we know why they shot the goofy angle with Sion and Crimson, where Crimson basically fed Jax Dane to Sion, but Sion didn't take the bait. I still maintain the overbooking of that segment was absurd, but I guess they needed something to promote a title match for night 2. You know what would have been a better place for that? The YouTube shows. Just saying. By the way, Joe Galley brought up here in passing, but can someone explain to me whether we're supposed to refer to the guy as Mayweather or Crimson? To this day, I do not understand the interchangeability with the gimmick name and the real name. Like, if it's a copyright thing from when he worked in TNA years ago, fine, but I don't know, just call him fucking Anthony Mayweather then. This is the kind of stuff Russo used to do in WCW where he tried to mingle guys' work and shoot names into programs. Remember whether he called him Sting or Steve Borden. Because that's supposed to make it real. Because pro wrestling is fake. In case you haven't already figured that out. Anyway, the wrestling between the two guys was mostly fine. They had Jax Dane and that Silvio guy up on the ramp watching with beer and popcorn, which was at times distracting. The crowd really wasn't into it, but that also might have been the problem with the fact that the match involved Crimson. Sion ended up going over with a series of Death Valley drivers. That's kind of all I really care to comment on it. Crimson, it sucks because he's been around for years and he's certainly not a bad worker. I mean, I remember when he was really green in TNA when he first showed up. You guys remember when they did the whole undefeated Goldberg streak that no one gave a shit about? And then he sort of fizzled out of the company not too long after that. But I don't know, like, he was always a serviceable talent, but he was always missing something to me. Ring experience was his biggest setback early on, but after he'd been around the business for a while and now we kind of see him where he is in 2022, I mean, the basics are there. He still has good size, but is he someone I'd have given a considerable push if I were running a company? Probably not. I'd maybe use him sporadically as an undercard guy to do jobs every now and then, but is he someone I'd try to build a division around? Not really. And I'm not trying to belittle the guy or anything, but I think the NWA has the same TNA mentality or even AEW mentality where they see someone who is a recognized name from another big company and they just automatically assume that person is going to translate on their programming. With AEW, that is clearly not the case if history has dictated that. But I even see the same thing here in the NWA where they bring in some mid-card or undercard name from WWE or TNA years ago. They put them on their show and then they think people are going to care about them immediately. I don't know. Crimson is just one of those guys that doesn't translate to me. So following that was a women's street fight. And as soon as I saw the graphic on the screen that read Women's Street Fight, I said, say no more. That is a very easy skip for me. No, thank you. I have no desire to see anyone do a plunder match in modern wrestling anymore, much less the girls partake in all this bullshit too. So I went ahead and jumped to the Ricky Morton Homicide Junior Heavyweight title match. And the first thing I noted about this match was the bantering that Homicide gave to Ricky before they even locked up. The only word I can make out was him saying, die, to Ricky. And as the announcers were sitting there wondering what Homicide just said, Joe Galli point blank responds with, I think he just threatened to kill him. Ha ha. Comedy. You will be relieved to know that Homicide did not perform said execution attempts on Ricky here. Instead, they had a relatively passable match per Ricky Morton standards in 2022. They actually didn't have what I would call the stereotypical Ricky Morton match. They were actually pretty 50-50 in terms of trading moves back and forth. Poor Ricky at one point tried to do the code red on Homicide and totally fucked it up, but yeah, what can you do? I just rolled my eyes at it. Oh, Ricky. Trying that modern wrestling garbage that you guys never would have thought twice about doing back in the day because it is stupid. Don't play into the games. Keep it basic, my friend. Arm drag, take over, grab a hold. The finish was a little wonky. It was also flat, but that's kind of how modern wrestling finishes are anymore. Just flat finishes everywhere. Everyone does 630 splashes, kicks out of everything, and then someone wins with a roll-up. But Homicide ends up raking Ricky's eyes and then basically cold cocks him in the back of the head and lays him out. And even though he pinned him, the announcers were playing up the story that it was an unprotected shot where in normal mixed martial arts rules, he would have been disqualified. But here, in the fake sport that is professional wrestling, apparently these guys are okay to do this kind of stuff. As long as the ref doesn't see it. And by the way, when he says unprotected blow, that's opposed to what? A protective blow? Where both guys are actively cooperating with each other and covering up? I don't know. The whole finishing sequence was wacky. Then we had the Nick Aldis Flip Gordon match. Yes, this was apparently Aldis' punishment match after being taken out of the world title match with Trevor. Again, for reasons that were never explained. And, I hate to once again revert back to the cold match complaint, but again, man, when you're expected to pay a sticker price to watch these shows, Unless you're a diehard fan of the product, who in their right mind is going to pay to see a bunch of cold pay-per-view matches with little forethought going in? I don't know, it just seems like a waste of money to me, especially in this economy. It was a decent match. Would have been a serviceable top-of-the-hour main event on TV, but would I have paid to watch a match like this if they didn't do anything to build it up on the TV show? No. I haven't seen a whole lot of Flip Gordon stuff. The name Flip is already concerning on paper, especially in this generation of wrestling. Turns out he doesn't do a whole lot of flippy stuff. He's mostly grounded and worked like someone that actually knew the basics. But there was some good stuff here. There was a really cool spot at one point where Aldis tried to give Flip an Irish Curse backbreaker off the top rope, and then Flip kind of rolled that through and countered it by powerbombing Aldis off the top. Looked really impressive. And there were parts of me that thought back to the Davey Richards match where I'm wondering at various points, why is this match so competitive when we're supposed to buy Nick Aldis as a top guy and he's struggling to beat a job guy from an outside promotion? I mean, at least Flip Gordon looks like an actual athlete, so I can give him brownie points for that. But the finish was Flip trying for a Tiger feint kick across the ring post. Nick caught him and ended up tapping him out with the cloverleaf. It was an adequate enough match between two good workers, but without ever having been given a reason to care about it initially, it's all I really got out of it. There was no story here, there was no personal beef or issue. It was just Nick Aldis needed a pay-per-view spot, so here you go. You know, as far as the whole afterbirth thing with Odinson running in to lay both guys out, I mean, it was completely random and out of the blue, but you know, they also shot the heat angle with him the previous night where he got DQ'd in his match with Chris Adonis. So I guess they're going to try and start building him as a top heel. Don't have an opinion either way, but the guy looks badass. So sure, why not? Got to start elevating new guys eventually. So Odinson isn't the worst guy to run with. Following that was the Tornado Tag match with Aaron Stevens and Rodney Mack versus the Pope and Kratos, who I could have sworn was teaming with Aaron Stevens last we saw him, but I was really never able to figure out that whole convoluted tag partners that couldn't get along story. I honestly don't even remember the last time I saw Kratos on this show, and all of a sudden he's on this show teaming with the Pope and wrestling his former tag partner. Okay, then. Anyway, the tornado thing did not bother me as much as you probably figured it would, because at least I know with the NWA, guys aren't going to be doing 10,000 flips and corkscrews and meaningless dives where you can't keep track of anything that's going on. So the tornado rules where guys weren't actually tagging did not weigh the match down. You know, they shot the deal early on where Kratos chased Aaron to the back while Pope and Rodney did their thing in the ring, wherein during that exchange, Pope managed to hold up Rodney Mack in a delayed vertical suplex for almost a full minute. Effortlessly. That guy's fucking strong. But, I mean, they did a lot of four-way spots. They teased some dive spots, but didn't actually execute them because they're smart. There was actually a kind of a funny moment where Aaron tried to do a promo on the fans and says he's not getting suckered into this whole car wreck stunt show garbage. He's above men like Kratos. And he proceeds to go into the ring to immediately get laid out with a sit-out spine buster. Highly comedic. And, well, they did more stuff for a while. Eventually, they all brought up the aisleway to go behind the entrance curtain. And this next sequence, this might have been the damnedest thing I've ever seen on a wrestling show in the last 20 years. And surprisingly enough, as wacky and hokey and campy as the whole thing was, I didn't actually hate this by the end. In fact, I somewhat enjoyed it. Because this is actually really creative with what they did. So, for those of you that didn't watch the show, they've got the two Jumbotron screens on both sides of the stage. So when both guys brawled back behind the curtain, they split off to two separate paths, so one could stand behind one of the screens, and then the other guy could stand behind the other screen, and they were doing like stereo punches from both sides. And what it ended up creating was a silhouette effect where we saw the shadow punches. It was a pretty cool idea. And the whole thing ends up leading to a deal where Pope and Kratos, who are standing on opposite ends of the stage in the silhouettes, they end up giving Aaron Stevens a back and forth 1-2 punch deal. And Aaron is stumbling and fumbling back and forth between the monitors while Pope and Kratos are giving him punches. Like, it's straight out of a cartoon. And I was like really prone to shit on this because of how stagey it looked. But when I think about the creativity that went into planning a spot like this, and the fact that I've never seen anything like this tried before in all my years of watching wrestling, I actually do have to kind of give them credit, because that was extremely well done. I think the reason more or less I liked it is it actually led to the finishing sequence, because Kratos ends up getting the claw locked in on Stevens, and then he ends up knocking him off the stage with a punch. And when Rodney tries to run back in to lock in a chicken wing hold on the Pope, Kratos ends up reaching out from the bottom part of the stage. He pulls out Rodney's leg so the Pope can fall back on him and pin his shoulders. Like I said, this is all really well executed. So while I was fixed to hate on it because of the goofiness of it, they pulled it off. And in essence, at least it was done the right way, with the goal of humiliating the heel and putting the babyfaces over strong in the end. You know, it didn't lead to another 10 minutes of bullshit where the heel team ended up winning anyway with a wrestling move in the middle of the ring. So I actually give that match a thumbs up. After that was Tom Latimer versus EC3, which was another holdover from the previous night's story. I don't know if I mentioned that before, but yeah, during that EC3 promo, Latimer came out to confront him, and Ethan basically told him to follow his narrative or something cryptic like that. And even if I'm still not sold on the whole CYN dynamic, the match was going along perfectly fine until the lame run-in finish. And I'll touch on it in a sec, but they basically played up a story that EC3 was toying around with Latimer early on, and he ended up getting in his face, so Latimer started firing back after EC3 spat and slapped him across the face. And right before he goes to put away EC3, 3 large men in all black hit the ring and start putting the boots to Latimer. We were told these men were part of Control Your Narrative. I had figured they were 3 fans that got lost coming back from the concession stand. I've never seen these men before. I had no idea who they were supposed to be. They looked like every generic tattooed bar wrestling dweeb you've ever seen. And they beat up Latimer. They held him on the mat so EC3 could not hit him over the head with a chair, but whisper something into his ear. And then all 4 guys left. So I don't know what the deal is with this whole group, or whether or not they're going to be a mainstay on the NWA going forward, but so far I'm not impressed. Camille and Max the Impaler had their Women's World title match. Camille had a great match with Taya the night before, and well, unfortunately she wasn't in there with an experienced worker this go around, so this is going to be a little more of a challenge. Definitely difficult to top from night 1. I actually kind of like the dynamics of this match more than the Camille Taya match, just because of how different Max is in terms of the look and the way she carries herself in the ring. Again, I talked about it before when I first saw her, but it's very Awesome Kong-like. She's big, but she lays everything in, and she delivers her punches like a guy would. You know, I know people get bent out of shape when people say that, but I mean, it's true. She hits like a guy would. That's a compliment for all of you idiots out there that don't understand wrestling. Here's what I'll say about this match overall. It was a totally different match from the one Camille had with Taya. And even though I wouldn't say this was as strong or technically sound as the Taya match, I like this for a whole different reason. You know, in the Taya match, Camille was mostly working on top and had more of the power game on her side. Because even though Taya's not a particularly small girl, Camille is still noticeably taller and bigger than her. But because Max is even bigger than Camille is, it basically forced Camille to work a completely different role. She basically had to be the scrappy underdog babyface. And this is part of the reason I've been complaining about Camille doing so much selling on the power shows by working with all the undercard talent, because it kind of took away from the visual of seeing Camille in a real vulnerable position. Say she was ever paired up with a Max the Impaler. Still, the story worked for what they were going for. Camille basically worked from underneath the entire time. She broke out some top rope drop kicks and high risk offense at one point just to try and get Max flat on her back to even get her in a pinning predicament, which I liked, because, we hadn't seen Max the Impaler on her back in a lot of cases, so this was good. She'd been working that monster heel roll for a while. Camille hit a nice little torture rack backbreaker at one point, got a great pop. They ended up building to a great heat spot at the end where Camille got the spear on Max, but James Mitchell threw her foot on the bottom rope. And of course, when Camille goes out to confront him, they had to spawn out the rest of the goofball faction, including Gags the Gimp and Sal the Pal, which, God, I can't believe I'm even uttering those names out of my mouth. Thank God Camille laid waste to them like geeks, but that's about the best usage I could get out of two clowns like that. Getting beat up by the girls division. At least it's visually believable because they're both pretty much $140 soaking wet. So, of course, Camille got back in the ring and ate a wasteland backbreaker for a good near fall. And after she tried going for it again, Camille gave Max a back body drop. They did a double down spot. And after Max tried to drive Camille into the corner with a series of shoulder tackles, Camille dodged a running clothesline attempt. Max went shoulder first into the post, and then Camille rolled her up and got the pin to retain the strap. It's a really strong match, especially considering the experience level for both girls. Max obviously hasn't been wrestling that long, and she's relatively new to the business, but, Camille has only really started to come into her own in the last year or so. Maybe a year and a half, especially as a wrestler. But I enjoyed this match. Camille really knocked it out of the park both nights. She was easily the MVP of the NWA 74 event, no question. A great title match with Taya on night one, and a surprisingly good match with Max the following night. So I definitely tip my hat to Camille. She went out there and she worked, and she earned both of her slots for that night. But that brought us to the main event. It is Tyrus versus Trevor Murdoch for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. The match they tried to hard sell on night one in the semi-main event instead of, power. But I've already given them enough flack for that, so we're going to move on from it. But here's the ultimate question I think a lot of us were wondering. Was Trevor going to be able to get a good pay-per-view quality match out of Tyrus? Well, this wasn't boring. I'll give it that. It was actually a relatively exciting title match. They started off really hot with Trevor immediately going out to the floor to lay out Black Cheese with a DDT right after the opening bell. And when Tyrus tried to charge him in the corner, Trevor caught him with a boot and immediately hit him with a top rope bulldog for a very close pin. I thought they were going to end the match right there, but, this ain't AEW Dynamite. They're not going to bury their top guy in 3 minutes for no reason and screw people out of an advertised world title match. Wink, wink. Obviously, that meant Tyrus was going to have a string of heat spots, which I know people usually crap on because it's not the most exciting thing to watch. I didn't think it was that bad. I kind of popped at the spot where Tyrus was doing push-ups on Trevor's back. But, say what you want about the guy. The one thing that I've always credited Tyrus for, even if his matches are slow and plotty, the dude's not stupid. He knows how to engage with the crowd and play off their emotions. They eventually built to the spot where Tyrus smashed Trevor into the official in the corner, and that led to a really good sequence where Trevor teased using the ring bell, but after disposing of it, Tyrus gave him the heart punch. Only a near fall, though, but it was good. They played up the fact that Trevor was the first guy to kick out of it. And I actually knew that headed in. They've been protecting that move for so long on the power shows. Whereas other times they say someone kicks out of a move for the first time, like we're all just supposed to know that it was the first time and be shocked by it. And no one ever is. And I like the little finishing deal they did. They had Tyrus on the floor also teasing he was going to use the ring bell on Trevor behind the ref's back. But he just couldn't do it. Because they blood related. Can't hit a brother like that. Can't do him dirty. Anyway, well, that led to a spot where after Tyrus threw him back into the ring, Trevor immediately gave him a double shot to the gonads, hit him with a top rope bulldog for a 2 count, and then went back up and hit him again for the 3. I don't really know if they needed a kick out of the first bulldog, but it is what it is. I don't think people expected Tyrus to win the belt anyway, but yeah, it was a perfectly fine main event title match. It's not winning match of the year or anything, but when you factor in that it was a Tyrus match, the bar was already set pretty low to begin with, but he certainly worked hard here. He did not disappoint. The whole post-match thing with Trevor trying to do the sympathy babyface promo on Tyrus, only for him to flip over the table and walk out before Trevor could finish his slot. I don't know what he was referencing, but certainly left for a good hangnail. It's just too bad we won't be sticking around for the NWA to see where it goes. God, the show killed me. Well, promised we were going to go out with a bang. Look, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time dwelling on this because I've already kind of said my piece with NWA over the last few Monday shows. I said that this was going to be the ultimate test to see whether or not I was going to be hooked to keep watching the power shows going forward. And, if you already haven't gathered my overall reporting on the show, it's not that hard to tell that I really wasn't impressed with what I saw. Camille was the star stud of both nights, but aside from some good wrestling and some interesting moments on both shows, again, it does not make up for the fact that about 75% of the card was mostly random, thrown together matches with not a whole lot of story or intrigue going in. And I know we live in the generation of wrestling where people don't really care about storylines or characters or any of the old standard traditions of the wrestling business. I still maintain that if I'm being ordered to pay for something to watch it, I expect that I'm given a reason to want to pay to watch it. And name value alone is not enough for me. It's not. The business is not as strong as it once was. Maybe back in the day if it was, Steve Austin, for example. Maybe. And, on the other side of that spectrum, for the people that have the Fight TV subscriptions, it's probably not a big deal because technically they're not even really paying a full pay-per-view price to watch it. And that's kind of been the NWA model anyway. If they only air the pay-per-views on Fight TV and people already have the subscription, they're probably going to watch regardless of whether or not they're following the product. And it's understandable. It's not like they're being asked to pay a premium price of $45 to $50 for the thing. So I get it. It's a different time, a different era, and I know I'm still stuck with the old mentality of how the wrestling business used to run pay-per-views. With that said, the other thing that I really haven't been all that impressed with when it comes to the NWA is where they are currently with star power and company intrigue. It's just not there for me right now. We talked about it before. When the NWA resurfaced 3 years ago and people were hot for the idea of a product reverting back to the studio format, it was a hooker for a lot of people. They got accustomed to the boring trope of the WWE production. There was a genuine interest in seeing how the NWA was going to present something contrary to what WWE or even AEW was doing at the time. And it worked. But, the scamdemic hit, a lot of their initial key roster got scooped up by WWE and AEW, and it just feels like the company's been stuck in limbo mode. Like they're picking up scraps at the remaining indie circuit just to even assemble a roster. They got names like Nick Aldis and Trevor Murdoch and Pope, and yeah, there's still notable names there. But how much are those guys really hooking in new eyeballs? At this point, name power just isn't enough for me. I need more. I need consistently booked storylines that make sense from show to show. I need characters that I can get behind and invest in from week to week. The problem with the NWA and the way they tape their programs, it almost feels like they go through cycles where certain guys are left off of shows for weeks, sometimes months at a time. It's really hard to get invested in anything when you only see guys show up here and there, but they're not consistently being featured on the program. The NWA model right now is just... It seems too much like they're dueling back and forth with themselves over what they really want to be as a company. Do they want to be an old school studio format, or do they want to be a higher production indie fed? At times it comes across like a classic studio show, and other times it comes across like, well, exactly that. A better produced independent federation. Kind of like the way Hunter used to run NXT back in the day, but with way less star power and production value. So I think what I need to do is just take a break from the product, check back, see where they are in, I don't know, maybe 6 months. See where they are in January of next year and note if they've done anything to change my mind or hook me back in. Because after the show ended, I'm starting to get worried with that whole control your narrative thing and them introducing that. I have a feeling that's going to start overshadowing the actual NWA product. I'm all for cross-promotional storylines when they fit, but to me it seems like they're going to try to run with a whole invasion story, and again, that's another concept that just needs to be buried in the business. It always sucks. To my recollection, there's never been a single wrestling company that's ever got the invasion story right, up to including the WWF, and I just don't want to see it. Focus on your talent pool, get those people over, and show that you can book a long-term sustainable product with your top guys that we can all get behind. It's too much stop and start booking with this product, and I already see enough of that on Wednesday on TBS, so I don't need another company following that same format. It's tough, I get it, but there's better ways to operate. So I really do wish the NWA the best of luck. There are aspects of this product that I always enjoy, but is it something that I really feel that I need to keep on investing in? Not at the moment. Just kind of feels like a chore to watch the power shows at this point. The pay-per-views actually end up usually delivering to some degree. And like I said, there was a lot of good stuff on both of these shows, but was it enough to justify had I paid to see it? Because I streamed it, obviously, but I didn't pay for it. No, I don't think it was. So there's a problem there, and that needs to be adjusted, for lack of better terms. So I'll check back in a few months to see where they're at, but as of right now, I'm going to sit out these next several months and replace the NWA reports with something that we recently talked about, putting as a substitution for the Monday shows. I'm going to give it a go. There's a lot of positive buzz right now with the WWE product. Hunter back in the equation. People are starting to be a little more cautiously optimistic about it. I'm not quite on that bandwagon where I'm ready to invest myself back into the 3-hour Raw deal, but Friday Night SmackDown is still a thing, and I'm going to give it a go. We're going to invest in WWE SmackDown as the NWA replacement. We will not be starting that for a couple weeks, though, because next week we have the AEW and the WWE shows that we're going to be running down, both pay-per-view events. So I'm going to hold off for a couple weeks to get back into the swing of things. But we are going to start reporting on WWE SmackDown from now until whenever I get fed up with it, basically. Could be 2 months, Could be 2 weeks. I don't know. It all depends. But like I said, WWE has a lot of steam right now. I don't know how long that's going to last, but I feel like I'll get more out of it than the NWA product. So it's one of those things where we're just going to roll the dice, give it a shot, and who knows, maybe hopefully it'll generate some more views on the channel, because, people do check out WWE content reviews, podcasts, things like that. So, I'm hoping to garner a little bit of more buzz on the channel going forward, because we're picking up a little bit of steam here. I've noticed more views. I've gained a couple more subscribers. So that's good. It's slow progress, but I always appreciate the support. And listen, I'm going to say this before we wrap up. By the way, if you haven't already, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Like the show. Stop back every Monday and Friday for the new podcast. This one is going to go up late. I can already tell that now. I'm not going to be able to edit this and get it up for Monday, so it will be delayed for Tuesday. We'll see about next week too, but there was just a lot of material we covered here, so you're going to have to give me some free time to sit down and actually edit the podcast. But the one thing I'll say here real quick, you're not always going to agree with what I say, and some people might get turned sideways at some of the comments that I make. I promise you, it's all in good faith. I try to crack jokes. I'm not what you would say a politically correct person. I'm not into that whole deal. But understand that what I say on this show, it comes from a place of good heart. So if I'm ever frustrated with something or I don't like the way something's done, I'm not trying to denigrate the people that put it together. I'm just giving my honest opinion of it. I'm explaining why I don't like it, why it doesn't work for me, and we move on. So, not trying to break the fourth wall here or anything like that, but if you ever watch this podcast and you feel like I'm coming across too much like a gimmick at times, to an extent I am, but also understand that I've been a fan of this business for a long time. I love professional wrestling, and I want to see the modern products do well. I really do. There's some great talent working out there right now, and I want to put my stock in them. But I also need to see that the company is also investing in that talent too. I need to see that there's a mutual split from both parties. I can like certain people, I can push for certain people, but if the company's showing that they're not willing to do the same and reciprocate it, it makes it hard for me to defend them. Especially with AEW. AEW has a large talent pool assembly, but even if a lot of that roster is not my flavor, there's still plenty of gold nuggets in there. So we will see how things go in the future. But again, if you stuck through the whole show here, thank you, greatly appreciated. And we will be back this Friday for the Dynamite review and the continuation of both our Retro series content. So take care all, and peace out.